When we think of the Middle Ages, we often imagine a world ruled by kings and bishops, castles towering over muddy villages, knights in shining armor, and peasants bowing in obedience. Yet the real heart of medieval Europe was not found in palaces or cathedrals. It lived in the villages, thousands of them scattered across green valleys, forests, and riverbanks where people tilled the soil, brewed their ale, and prayed for mercy. And in these villages, life was governed not only by the will of God or the power of nobles, but by something far stranger and older, local law. Before the rise of centralized kingdoms and uniform codes of justice, every village had its own way of keeping order. Some laws were written on parchment and sealed by lords. Others existed only in memory, passed down from elder to elder, or recited aloud at gatherings near the church door. They were rules born from necessity, superstition, and centuries of custom. Together they formed a web of expectations that bound people to their land, to their neighbors, and to their fears. In medieval Europe, there was no clear line between law, religion, and folklore. To steal from a neighbor's field was not merely a crime, it was a sin that might bring a curse on the whole community. To break the Sabbath was not just a matter of conscience, it could offend God and cause storms or crop failure. To offend the local lord might not only cost you your freedom but damn your soul. Law was both earthly and divine, written by men but overseen by heaven. Every village, no matter how small, had its own gathering place where justice was done. It might be a wooden bench under a large tree, a space beside the market cross, or a simple hall near the church. The people called it many names: the moot, the court, the hundred, the assembly, but its purpose was always the same: to settle disputes, punish wrongs, and preserve peace. In the absence of professional judges, justice was carried out by men of standing: reeves, bailiffs, elders, and priests who represented both lord and community. To modern ears, their decisions could sound bewildering. A man who stole bread might be forced to carry it through the streets while the villagers jeered. A woman who cursed her neighbor could be made to stand barefoot in the snow. A child who broke the Sabbath might be whipped, not by the priest, but by his own father in front of witnesses. Punishment was rarely about rehabilitation. It was about restoration, restoring the balance between sin and consequence, between human and divine order. But how did these strange rules begin? The answer lies in the uncertainty of medieval life. Villages were isolated worlds, vulnerable to famine, disease, and violence. Every harvest could be a matter of survival. A single thief or blasphemer might, in the eyes of the people, endanger everyone. Law became a collective spell, a ritual designed to keep chaos at bay. When the villagers gathered to pronounce judgment, they were not only enforcing justice, they were reminding themselves that order still existed in a world that often seemed to teeter on the brink of disaster. Many of these laws reflected the deep religiosity of the age. The church taught that all authority flowed from God, and so even the humblest village law carried a sacred weight. Oaths were sworn on relics or on the Gospels. Trials began and ended with prayer. If a man was accused of lying, he might be made to take a holy oath before the altar, an act so terrifying that few dared to perjure themselves. To swear falsely was to invite eternal damnation. Thus, divine fear became the foundation of earthly justice. Yet divine fear was only half of the story. The other half was local tradition, a legacy older than Christianity itself. Many villages still remembered pre-Christian customs, rites tied to the seasons, to harvest festivals, to the spirits of fields and wells. These ancient practices quietly influenced the law. A thief might be punished not only to avenge his victim, but to appease the spirit of the land. An oath might be sworn not only on a Bible, but over a stone or tree that had stood for generations. In this way, medieval law was a strange hybrid, half Christian, half pagan, entirely human. In some places, the law was spoken aloud once a year in a ceremony called the View of Frank Pledge. All the men of the village would gather, and the local reeve would read or chant the laws by memory. Every household head would swear to uphold them. It was not just a bureaucratic ritual. It was a communal oath of survival. To break the law was to break faith with the entire community. The people lived and died by these rules, and though they might seem absurd to us now, they made perfect sense to those who believed the world was full of invisible dangers. Consider how even simple acts could become legal matters. If your cow wandered into your neighbor's field and ate his grain, you might owe a fine of 2 hens or a measure of barley. If your dog killed another man's sheep, the law might demand the dog's death. But if you refused to kill the dog, the priest could declare your household cursed. A single accident could spiral into spiritual crisis. Justice in these villages was intensely personal. There were no police, no lawyers, no jails in the modern sense. When someone committed an offense, the community itself responded. The victim's family would confront the offender before the elders. Witnesses, often friends or kin, would give their word. The reeve or lord would pronounce a sentence, which might be a fine, a public apology, or corporal punishment. Then life went on. The goal was not endless litigation, but restored peace. Still, peace could be cruel. Medieval punishments often relied on humiliation and spectacle. To be mocked in the marketplace was sometimes worse than a beating. The community's laughter was a powerful weapon, capable of shaming even the most stubborn offender. Some punishments were symbolic. A thief might be forced to wear the stolen object around his neck. A liar might be gagged with a wooden bit. Others were deeply physical: stocks, whips, or the dreaded ducking stool. Each punishment served as a public warning: break the law, and you break your place in the world. It was this combination of fear, faith, and community that gave medieval village law its unique flavor. The rules were not always fair, but they were understood. They emerged from the rhythms of rural life, the cycle of planting and harvest, feast and famine, birth and death. Every law had a purpose, even if that purpose seems absurd today. The ban on eating certain foods, the regulation of clothing, the fines for brewing bad ale, all were meant to protect the fragile harmony of the village. Over time, as kingdoms expanded and royal courts grew stronger, these local laws began to change. Kings wanted uniformity. Priests wanted purity. But in the early and high Middle Ages, before the long arm of royal justice reached every valley, the village remained its own little universe, ruled by its own customs. The law of one valley might differ entirely from that of the next. In one, a man might be fined for letting his chickens cross the Lord's road. In another, he might be required to kiss the village cross to prove his repentance. Travelers often found these variations bewildering. A merchant passing through 3 towns might unknowingly break 3 different laws: one for selling bread on a saint's day, another for failing to remove his hat before the church, another for bringing a foreign animal into the marketplace. To live in medieval Europe was to live in a patchwork of micro-worlds, each governed by a peculiar sense of order, and within that patchwork lay countless oddities. Laws that banned the wearing of bright colors, rules that required villagers to shout warnings before emptying chamber pots into the street, decrees that declared frogs or beetles to be public nuisances. Some laws were serious, others absurd, but all of them tell us something profound about the medieval mind: the constant struggle to impose meaning on a chaotic world. To modernize, these laws appear laughable or cruel, but laughter is a luxury of safety. For medieval villagers, every law was a lifeline. They believed that by obeying these strange rules, by respecting the sacred, fearing the profane, and submitting to ritual, they could hold the darkness at bay. Thus, the birth of order was not a triumph of reason, but a triumph of fear harnessed into structure. The villagers of medieval Europe lived by rules that seem bizarre to us precisely because they believed that life itself was fragile, that God and the devil watched every action, and that a single misstep could tip the balance between survival and ruin. This was the world of the weird and wonderful village laws of medieval Europe, a world where pigs could be tried in court, bread could be sacred, and the sound of church bells might decide when a man could speak. In the chapters that follow, we will walk through these villages, law by law, and uncover the forgotten logic that once ruled the daily lives of our ancestors. For in the Middle Ages, the law was not just a system, it was a stone, and every villager, whether they knew it or not, was living inside the enchantment. In the strange tapestry of medieval village life, there was no such thing as separation between the body, the land, and the law. A person's body was not just their own, it was part of the community's moral fabric, as sacred and as vulnerable as the soil that fed them. To harm your neighbor's body was to offend the natural order. To abuse your own body was to offend God. Thus, the laws that governed medieval villagers often blended the physical and the spiritual, the earthy and the divine in ways that could both astonish and terrify the modern mind. Consider first the laws of the body, those rules that dictated how one might eat, work, dress, or even smell. Hygiene was not merely a matter of health, it was a matter of morality. A person who failed to wash before church could be publicly rebuked by the priest, not because they were dirty, but because filth was seen as a sign of sin. Dirt was moral corruption made visible. In some parishes, those who refused to bathe before Easter or Christmas Mass could be fined a chicken or required to sit apart from the congregation. But the strangest laws concerned not filth but modesty. A woman who dressed above her station, wearing bright colors or fine lace beyond what her husband could afford, could be accused of vanity, a sin that disrupted the social order. The reeve or elder might summon her before the village court, and her punishment might be to wear her husband's work apron to church for a week, to remind everyone of her proper place. These so-called sumptuary laws were meant to preserve the hierarchy. The peasant should look like a peasant, the merchant like a merchant, and the lord like a lord. To blur those lines was to risk chaos. Clothing laws extended to men as well. In some English and German villages, men were forbidden from wearing boots with long points, so-called poulaines, which were seen as prideful and effeminate. In France, certain towns banned the color scarlet for anyone below the rank of knight, while in Italy, laws dictated the maximum width of a man's sleeves. To modern eyes, these details seem trivial. Yet, in a world obsessed with order, fashion itself was political, a visible sign of the cosmic ladder that stretched from peasant to pope. Equally strange were the laws governing food and drink. Villagers lived by the rhythm of feast and fast, dictated not only by hunger but by the church calendar. On Fridays and during Lent, meat was forbidden, yet what counted as meat was not always clear. In some coastal towns, an enterprising monk argued that beavers counted as fish because they lived in water, and thus could be eaten during Lent. The argument was accepted, and for centuries, beavers and occasionally puffins were legally considered fish. In many villages, the quality of bread and ale was strictly regulated. Bakers and brewers were vital to survival, and dishonest ones could be dangerous. If a baker sold loaves that were underweight, he might be forced to parade through the market carrying his false scales. If a brewer watered down her ale, she could be tied to the cucking stool and dunked into a pond. These punishments, though humiliating, were rarely fatal. They were meant to purify both the offender and the community. The villagers believed that shame washed away sin just as water washed away dirt. Beyond food and clothing, the human body itself became an object of legal control. Sexual conduct was policed with obsessive fervor. Adultery, fornication, and even unlawful kissing could bring heavy penalties, especially for women. In some German villages, a woman caught with a lover could have her hair shaved as a mark of disgrace. In England, a man accused of seducing another man's betrothed might be forced to carry a heavy stone through the village, symbolizing the burden of sin. The act was as theatrical as it was punitive, a performance of morality meant to deter others. One law from 14th century Flanders even declared that no unmarried couple could be seen walking together after sunset without a lantern. This was not simply prudishness. It reflected a deep anxiety about hidden sins, about what might happen when bodies met in darkness. The body, in medieval thought, was the gateway to both sin and salvation. Every gesture, every appetite, was charged with meaning. And then there were the laws of work, the sacred duty to labor. Medieval villagers believed that idleness was the root of evil, that a man who did not work threatened the community as much as a thief or a witch. Laws required every able-bodied person to contribute to the village's survival. Those caught loitering during harvest season could be fined, whipped, or forced into unpaid labor. In some manorial records, there are even entries for sleeping in the fields, a punishable offense for those who dozed while others reaped. The sweat of labor was an offering to God. To neglect one's duties was to break the moral contract between man and heaven. This belief gave rise to some truly bizarre regulations. In one English manor, workers were forbidden from singing while threshing grain because it was deemed an occasion for levity. In another, the reeve ordered that no man could plow while drunk, lest the furrows become crooked, for the devil enters where the line bends. It was not only humans who were bound by law, animals, too, could be held accountable. This was perhaps the most bewildering aspect of medieval justice. Animals that caused harm could be formally tried, convicted, and punished, often in ceremonies that mimicked human trials. A pig that killed a child could be dressed in a coat, brought before the court, and sentenced to hanging. A rooster that laid an egg, a rare but possible anomaly, might be burned as an agent of the devil. The logic behind such trials was not madness but morality. If animals lived in the same world as humans, under the same God, then they too must be subject to divine justice. Some of these animal trials were astonishingly elaborate. In 1457, a sow and her 6 piglets were accused in Savigny, France, of murdering a child. The sow was found guilty and hanged. The piglets, for lack of evidence, were acquitted. Records show that the villagers watched in solemn silence as the sentence was carried out. To them, justice had been served not only for the child, but for the moral order of the world. Insects could also face prosecution. Locusts, rats, and weevils were sometimes excommunicated by the church. Priests would gather the villagers, recite formal prayers, and command the pests to leave the fields in the name of Almighty God. The ritual might sound absurd, but it reflected a worldview in which all creation was bound by spiritual law. To drive away pests was not just a matter of pest control. It was a war between holiness and corruption. Such ceremonies reveal how deeply intertwined religion and law had become. The village priest was not merely a spiritual leader. He was often a legal authority. Disputes were settled in his presence, contracts sworn on his altar, and punishments blessed with his prayers. Even the smallest rule, a curfew bell, a fine for missing mass, was sanctified by divine authority. Law was never secular. It was an extension of theology. And yet, for all its severity, medieval village law could also be surprisingly flexible. Custom allowed for mercy. If a thief stole bread to feed his children, the elders might forgive him after a public apology. If a woman struck her husband in anger, she might avoid punishment by confessing before witnesses and donating candles to the church. The goal was not blind retribution, but harmony, the restoration of balance. Harmony, however, was fragile. Behind every law lay the fear of disorder, famine, plague, rebellion, or divine wrath. The people believed that even small sins could anger God and bring disaster upon all. To let one crime go unpunished was to risk the ruin of the entire village. Thus, the strangest laws of the Middle Ages often grew out of desperation, out of a desperate desire to control the uncontrollable. To modern minds, these laws seem alien, but to those who lived under them, they made sense. Every act of justice was an act of faith, every punishment a plea for mercy. The law was not just a system of rules, it was a living ritual, a way of keeping the world intact. And as the centuries turned, the laws of the body and the land would grow even more intricate. The next chapter in our journey takes us deeper into the moral geography of the medieval village, into the fields, the forests, and the crossroads where human law met the wild forces of nature, and where superstition began to merge with power. Ascety. Many records tell of priests who turned a blind eye, knowing that starving families could not afford holiness. Another fascinating aspect of medieval land law was the deep suspicion of waste. To waste food or land was to offend God, who gave the earth's bounty to sustain all. A farmer who left his fields unplanted might be fined. A miller who allowed grain to rot could be forced to repay his neighbors in kind. In one English manor, a man was punished for throwing away bread crusts, accused of showing contempt for the Lord's provision. Even firewood was sacred. Cutting green wood instead of dead wood could bring a fine, for it was said that living trees had souls. The relationship between people and animals was equally bound by law. Grazing rights were measured with meticulous care. Each household might be allowed 2 cows for sheep, and a pig to roam the commons. If one farmer sent too many animals, his beasts could be seized and impounded, locked in a pen until he paid a fine. These pens, or pinfolds, still appear in some villages today, moss-covered reminders of ancient justice. The fine for overgrazing was not only economic but moral. It was a sign of greed, a sin that threatened harmony. There were also laws meant to protect the fertility of the land itself. Certain fields were left fallow every few years to rest the soil. It was forbidden to walk on these plots, even at night, for fear of angering the spirits that dwelled beneath. Children who played there could be punished, not because of property but because of belief. Some villagers whispered that elves or saints guarded the fallow fields, and that disturbing them would make next year's crops wither. Seasonal ceremonies reinforced these laws. In the spring, the beating of the bounds saw the entire community, men, women, and children, march around the village perimeter, singing psalms and striking the boundary stones with willow branches. It was both a legal act and a ritual one, a way of refreshing memory, asserting unity, and warding off misfortune. In some regions, boys were whipped, likely during the procession, not as punishment but as a mnemonic device to ensure they never forgot where the boundaries lay. To know the bounds was to know the law itself. Even natural disasters were interpreted through the lens of law and morality. If a flood destroyed the fields, the villagers asked not what caused it but who. Had someone broken an oath? Had a blasphemer angered heaven? In such cases, the priest might order a public confession, followed by fasting and processions. The people would march through the fields carrying relics, chanting prayers to drive away the wrath of the skies. The line between natural law and divine punishment was non-existent. Every event had meaning, every misfortune demanded explanation. One of the strangest legal customs tied to land was the concept of blood fines. If a man was killed on another's property, the owner might owe compensation not for the murder, but for the pollution of the soil. Blood was believed to stain the ground spiritually, and until the debt was paid, the land was considered cursed. Some villages required that a priest bless the spot, sprinkling it with holy water before it could be farmed again. The law treated the earth as a living witness to sin. Disputes over land were among the most bitter and complicated. Boundaries were marked by trees, stones, and streams, but over time, these markers could shift or vanish. When neighbors quarreled, the entire village might be drawn into testimony. Witnesses swore oaths on relics, recalling where their grandfathers said the line had once run. The court's decision might be final, but resentment often lingered for generations. Some families carried feuds over inches of soil for centuries, their hatred sanctified by custom. The idea that land itself could bear witness gave rise to curious rituals of proof. In some places, a man accused of stealing land was made to lie down upon it and recite the Lord's Prayer. If he faltered or mispronounced a word, it was taken as a sign of guilt. In others, he might be required to carry a clod of the disputed earth to the church altar, symbolically returning it to God. These ceremonies seem quaint now, but in a world without paper deeds or survey maps, such symbolism was the only guarantee of truth. Underlying all of this was a profound reverence for the soil, a belief that the land was not a passive possession but a living entity that demanded respect. Laws were not made to dominate it but to appease it. The plowman's prayer, recited at the start of every season, captured this relationship perfectly. Bless this ground, O Lord, that it may bear fruit in due time. Spare it from hail and hunger, from worms and from weeds. Let no hand defile it with greed or blood, lest it turn against us in wrath. For the medieval villager, this was not poetry but reality. The land could love, or it could hate. It could reward the righteous with abundance, or curse the wicked with blight. To live justly was to keep the earth content. Thus, the fields themselves became the stage of law where divine order met human need, and where every seed carried a moral weight. As harvests rose and fell, so too did the fortunes of entire villages. And just as the soil demanded obedience, so did the unseen world that surrounded it, the forests, rivers, and crossroads where the wild things dwelled. In the next part, we step beyond the cultivated fields into the shadowed places of medieval Europe where the law of man faltered, and the laws of nature, superstition, and fear took hold. For in the woods, the medieval imagination saw not only wolves and outlaws but spirits and devils, and the laws made to restrain them were among the strangest of all. Beyond the tilled earth and the ringing church bells lay a different world, the forest. To the medieval villager, the forest was at once a place of bounty and of dread, a realm of resources, spirits, and hidden dangers. It was the age of civilization, the dark counterpart to the orderly fields, and it had laws of its own. If the village was the body of the medieval world, the forest was its wild soul, and to keep that wildness in check, humans forged rules, some practical, some superstitious, and many astonishingly strange. The forests of medieval Europe were vast and ancient. In some regions, they stretched unbroken for days of travel, home to wolves, boars, deer, and things less easily named. To the peasant, these woods were both a larder and a threat. They offered firewood, game, mushrooms, and herbs, but they also hid bandits, wolves, and spirits. The church and the crown saw the forest as something to be claimed and ordered its resources taxed, its dangers tamed. And so forest law was born, a system of rules that controlled what men could do beneath the canopy of leaves. The most powerful of these were the royal forest laws. In England and parts of France, vast tracts of land were declared forest, not in the sense of wilderness, but as territory under the king's direct protection. To hunt, cut wood, or even gather fallen branches there without permission was a crime against the crown. The penalty could be as severe as mutilation or death. The forest, in this sense, belonged not to the people, but to the monarch, and in it nature itself became royal property. Yet every village had its own little forest laws, shaped by local need and belief. These governed who could enter the woods, what they could take, and when. A villager might be allowed to collect dry wood but not to fell trees, to hunt rabbits but not deer, to gather berries only after a certain feast day. To break these rules was to invite punishment, but sometimes not from the reeve or the lord. Some believed the forest itself would take vengeance. Trees were more than timber. They were alive with meaning. The oldest oaks and yews were sacred, seen as dwelling places of spirits or saints. Cutting one down without ceremony was an act of sacrilege. There are records from France and Germany of men fined for felling the holy tree or wounding the saint's oak. Even the bark could be protected. In some villages, only widows were allowed to collect moss or fallen branches from certain groves, and they had to do so barefoot, in silence, as a sign of humility. This sense of sanctity extended to the animals of the forest. Wolves, though feared, were respected as creatures of God's creation. It was forbidden in some regions to kill a wolf during Lent, when all bloodshed was considered impure. Deer were the king's beasts, but they also held mystical significance. To kill one on a Sunday was said to bring a curse. The white stag, in particular, was considered a messenger of heaven. Those who hunted it were thought doomed to wander forever lost. The church's influence added yet another layer to forest law. Monks and priests often claimed certain glades or springs as holy sites, marking them with crosses or chapels. Pilgrims would visit to pray for healing or luck. Over time, these sacred spots gained legal protection. To damage them, or to hunt near them, was a punishable offense. One 13th century record from Normandy tells of a man who killed a hare beside a holy well and was made to stand naked before the altar as penance. The logic was clear. Even nature's creatures were under divine law. But the forest was also a hiding place for the lawless. Outlaws, fugitives, and heretics sought refuge there, giving rise to a different kind of rule, the law of sanctuary. In some areas, a man who fled into the woods could claim protection for a day and a night, provided he shouted a holy phrase, usually sanctuary, while crossing a certain boundary stone. The villagers might then be forbidden to harm him until dawn. This practice blurred the line between law and magic, between mercy and superstition. The deeper one went into the woods, the more the laws became entangled with fear. The peasants spoke of fairy circles, of lights that danced beneath the trees. To enter them, even by accident, was dangerous. Some villages forbade walking in certain parts of the forest after dusk, not for safety but for spiritual reasons. A man who ignored the curfew might be forced to fast or pay a fine, for it was said that wandering at night disturbed the unseen ones. Even sound had its rules. In the Black Forest of Germany, it was illegal to ring church bells during thunderstorms, lest the echo anger the forest spirits. In other places, bells were rung precisely to drive such spirits away. Each community developed its own understanding of how to live in harmony or in tension with the wild. There were laws, too, concerning what could be gathered. Herbs used in healing were surrounded by elaborate rituals. The gatherer had to speak prayers, face east, and cut the plant with a consecrated knife. To take herbs without these words was said to rob them of their virtue. In one English text, a healer accused of skipping the prayer was fined and ordered to return the plants to the ground, as if restoring their souls. The forest's fruits, acorns, nuts, berries were essential in lean years, yet even these were bound by law. The right to collect acorns, called pannage, was reserved in some places for certain families or granted by the Lord as a privilege. Peasants who let their pigs feed on another man's pannage without consent could lose the animals altogether. In bad harvests, fights over pannage rights could turn violent. The forest was not just a place of superstition but of survival, and survival had rules. Hunting was another matter entirely. The act of killing game was wrapped in ritual and regulation. A poacher caught with a deer might have his bow broken, his dog killed, or his hand branded with a mark of shame. Yet the villagers often celebrated poachers in secret, seeing them as heroes who defied the Lord's greed. Songs and stories grew around these figures, the seeds of later legends like Robin Hood. Law and resistance existed side by side, each defining the other. Curiously, not all forest laws were about control. Some existed to preserve harmony. In Scandinavia, certain trees were left untouched as guardian trees to shelter the spirits of ancestors. To harm them was thought to invite death into one's home. Even in Christian lands, this belief persisted under new names. A tree might be dedicated to a saint instead of a spirit, but the reverence remained. One record from Bohemia tells of a man who was struck by lightning after mocking a sacred ash tree. The villagers took it as divine justice. The church tried, often in vain, to root out these old customs. Priests preached against tree worship, issuing fines for those who left offerings of bread or milk at forest shrines. Yet the people persisted. They saw no contradiction between lighting candles in the church and tying ribbons to the sacred oak. Law could be written, but belief could not be erased. And so the strange coexistence of Christian commandment and pagan memory continued to shape forest justice for centuries. Perhaps the most haunting of all forest customs was the punishment for desecration. To spill blood in a holy grove, to cut down a tree marked with a cross, to dig where the dead were buried. These acts demanded purification. The offender might be made to carry a heavy log through the village, symbolizing the wounded tree, or to fast for 40 days. In some cases, he was forbidden to enter the woods again for a year and a day. The forest had to heal, just as the soul did. And yet, for all the fear that surrounded it, the forest remained a place of freedom, a realm where royal law thinned and local custom took root. It was a refuge for the poor, the desperate, and the imaginative. Here, the laws of man faltered, and the laws of nature, mystery, and belief ruled instead. By the late Middle Ages, when kings sought to map and tax every inch of their realms, the old forest laws began to fade. But their echoes endured. The idea that nature was sacred, that the earth had its own justice, would survive long after the last pagan groves had fallen. The villagers knew what we have half forgotten, that the wild world cannot truly be owned. It can only be respected, feared, and, sometimes, bargained with. In the next part, we leave the shadows of the forest and return to the village, but not to peace. For within the walls of the settlement itself, stranger laws awaited, laws of marriage and morality, of gossip and honor, of sin whispered through the alleys. If the forest held the fear of the unknown, the village held the fear of each other. If the forest was ruled by the laws of nature and superstition, the village itself was governed by the laws of morality and reputation. Within its timbered fences and cobbled lanes, every soul was known, every sin remembered, and every whisper carried weight. The smallest transgression could stain a name for generations. In medieval Europe, crime was not only what one did, it was who one was and who others believed one to be. The church stood at the center of this moral universe. Its steeple dominated the skyline, and its bells dictated the rhythm of life: dawn prayers, noontime work, evening mass. But beyond prayers and sacraments, the church served another role, that of moral watchman. Priests, confessors, and parish clerks kept their eyes and ears open, ready to enforce laws both divine and local. Yet much of that enforcement came not from clergy, but from the community itself, neighbors, kin, rivals, for medieval law was as much social as it was spiritual. Consider the laws of marriage, perhaps the most tangled and intrusive of all. Marriage was not just a union of love or property, it was a binding moral contract, and the village was both witness and judge. In many regions, to marry without the church's blessing was illegal, but to live together before marriage could be worse. Fornication was treated as a public offense, not a private one. Couples found guilty could be paraded through the streets, forced to wear garlands of straw or nettles, symbols of shame. In one English village in the 13th century, a young man who courted a widow too openly was dragged to the church porch and made to confess aloud, "I have sinned," with words of passion. The crowd jeered, the priest blessed him, and the widow, her face red as wine, was ordered to kneel beside him. It was not simply punishment, it was purification by humiliation. The village believed that shame, like a fever, must be brought to the surface before it could heal. There were also laws against adultery, though punishment varied by wealth and gender. A lord's wife might be confined to a convent, a peasant woman could be shaved, flogged, or forced to carry a straw effigy of her lover. In Normandy, records tell of a woman tied to her husband's plow and made to walk the fields, a cruel reminder that she had sown another seed. Men, too, were punished, though more lightly: a fine, a night in the stocks, or public penance. It was said that God forgave easily, but the village did not. Even words could become crimes. Gossip, insult, and slander were treated with surprising seriousness, for reputation was the lifeblood of village life. To call a man a thief or a woman unchaste could spark lawsuits that dragged on for months. Medieval court rolls are full of such cases. She said, "I am a witch." He said, "I sleep with my neighbor." They said, "My father was a coward." These were not idle disputes, they were battles for honor. In some villages, A unique punishment existed for gossiping women, known as the scold's bridle or gossip's collar. It was a metal mask or cage fitted over the mouth, sometimes with a sharp bit that pressed against the tongue. The offender was led through the streets so all might see the lesson. In German towns, the punishment was more theatrical. The ducking stool, where the scold was tied to a chair and plunged into the river again and again until she begged forgiveness. The logic was grimly poetic. The mouth that stirred trouble must be silenced by water. Then there were the sumptuary laws, which governed not sin of word or deed, but of appearance. Clothing, jewelry, even the color of one's garments were regulated by rank and occasion. A peasant caught wearing velvet or silk could be fined heavily, for such finery was above his station. Women were forbidden from adorning themselves with more than a certain number of rings or ribbons. In some parts of Italy, widows could only wear black for a full year after their husband's death, under threat of penance. These laws reflected not vanity, but the medieval obsession with order, a world where everyone had their place visible at a glance. The church extended its moral reach into the bedroom as well. Priests preached from the pulpit about the laws of the flesh, specifying which days it was lawful for married couples to lie together. Intercourse was forbidden on Sundays, feast days, and during Lent or Advent, which left, by some reckonings, barely 100 pure nights a year. To break these rules was to risk divine wrath and, occasionally, public confession. In one case from the 14th century, a man confessed to relations with his wife on Good Friday and was ordered to crawl from his home to the church on his knees. Witchcraft, though rare in early medieval villages, lurked beneath many moral laws. A woman who gathered herbs, spoke charms, or cured with whispered prayers could find herself accused of maleficium, evil doing. Early records show that such accusations were less about sorcery than about fear and envy. If a cow went barren, if a child fell ill, if milk curdled for no reason, the neighbors might whisper that someone had looked with the wrong eye. The accused might be forced to swear innocence before the altar, holding a candle as proof of purity. If the flame flickered, it was said that the devil trembled within her. Superstition bled into justice in subtler ways too. Some villages practiced a ritual called ordeal by touch for suspected thieves. The accused would be made to touch the stolen item before witnesses. If they trembled or turned pale, guilt was presumed. In one French parish, a man accused of stealing bread was told to place his hand on the loaf and recite the Lord's Prayer. He stuttered halfway through, and that alone was taken as proof. In a world where divine judgment was thought immediate, the trembling hand or the stammering tongue carried the weight of law. The village also had its laws of silence, unspoken but universally understood. It was forbidden to speak ill of the dead, to mock the priest, or to question the fairness of the tithe. Even laughter had boundaries. To laugh during a funeral, or in church, was a sin that demanded penance. One chronicle tells of a shepherd boy who laughed aloud during Mass. He was made to fast for 40 days, to purge the devil of levity. Joy, like sin, required control. For women, the laws were often harsher. A wife who struck her husband could be paraded with a wooden ladle around her neck, a symbol of domestic rebellion. A widow who refused remarriage might be called witchwife or fined for neglecting her duties to the community. Conversely, a man who beat his wife was rarely punished unless he drew blood visible on the Sabbath. Such cruelty was justified as chastisement, though the church increasingly condemned it. Yet even condemnation was selective. The peace of the household mattered more than the suffering within it. Children, too, were bound by village morality. They could be punished for disobedience, idleness, or blasphemy. In one English manor, boys caught swearing were made to carry a heavy stone around the village square, while girls who neglected spinning were forced to sweep the churchyard at dawn. Every act of discipline carried a lesson. Obedience was holiness, and order was life. It was not all cruelty and constraint, however. These laws, strange as they seem, also knit the community together. Public penance could restore friendship. Gossip trials allowed enemies to settle grudges under the guise of righteousness. The church, for all its sternness, provided a language of forgiveness. A villager who confessed could rejoin the fold, cleansed of shame. In a world where survival depended on unity, moral law was both whip and glue. Still, behind every punishment lay fear. Fear of disorder, of lust, of laughter, of the unknown. The villagers lived in a web of custom, both protecting and strangling them. They believed that sin, left unpunished, spread like disease, that one man's shame could bring God's anger on all. Thus, they policed not only their own hearts but each other's. The medieval village was, in truth, a mirror of its faith, harsh, pious, suspicious, and endlessly fascinated by sin. Its laws may seem cruel now, but to those who lived under them, they were the scaffolding of salvation, the fragile line between chaos and grace. In the next part, we leave behind sin and scandal to explore another realm of strange justice, the world of animals and inanimate objects put on trial. Yes, in the courts of medieval Europe, pigs, roosters, and even insects could be condemned to death, and their trials were no jest, but a deadly serious reflection of how humanity saw the moral order of creation. It is difficult for the modern mind to imagine a time when animals could be summoned before a court of law, given defense counsel, and sentenced to death. Yet, across medieval Europe, this strange spectacle was a matter of sober procedure. From France to Switzerland, from Italy to the German lands, pigs, cows, goats, horses, dogs, and even insects found themselves accused of crimes ranging from murder to theft, blasphemy, and witchcraft. The reasoning behind such trials may seem absurd now, but to medieval villagers, it made perfect sense. If all creation was governed by divine law, then all creatures, man and beast alike, were accountable to it. The logic began with theology. In the Christian world of the Middle Ages, every living being had a place in the hierarchy of creation. Man stood above the animals, but all were bound by the same cosmic order decreed by God. When a pig killed a child, or when locusts devoured a harvest, it was not mere accident. It was a violation of divine harmony. And if divine order was broken, it had to be restored through ritual justice. The courtroom became a stage upon which that restoration was performed. Records from the 13th to the 16th centuries are full of such cases. In 1266, in the French town of Fontenay-aux-Roses, a sow was tried for killing a child. The proceedings followed all formalities. Witnesses were called, the animal was kept in prison, and a lawyer, yes, an actual human attorney, was appointed to defend it. After hearing testimony, the judge condemned the sow to be hanged in the public square, wearing a man's jacket and breeches as a sign of her human crime. The villagers gathered to watch, not as entertainment, but as penance. Justice was done, and balance restored. The dressing of animals in human clothing was more than humiliation. It symbolized the belief that the creature had temporarily crossed into the moral sphere of man. By killing a human, it had behaved as if it had free will and malice. Therefore, it had to suffer a human punishment. The animal's flesh might be buried rather than eaten, its blood sprinkled on the ground to cleanse the place of the crime. These gestures were echoes of ancient rituals, now wrapped in Christian robes. In the Swiss canton of Lausanne, a donkey was once tried for unnatural acts with a man. When the man was executed, the donkey too was condemned but later pardoned, after character witnesses swore that it had always been of gentle and virtuous demeanor. The absurdity masks a deeper truth. The court sought to uphold moral order, even in a case beyond reason. The donkey's pardon reaffirmed that sin lay in the human, not in the beast. In France, the church sometimes took jurisdiction over creatures smaller than the eye could easily see. There are numerous records of insect excommunication, in which locusts, beetles, or weevils were solemnly cursed from the pulpit for destroying crops. The bishop would issue an official writ ordering the insects to leave the diocese within 3 days, under pain of damnation. If they persisted, priests would gather the villagers and conduct a formal trial, reading indictments aloud before an empty chair that represented the accused. The sentence was excommunication, spiritual banishment from God's earth. The church took these cases seriously, recording them in legal Latin with the same care given to human disputes. One famous example comes from 1519 in Lausanne, where the local clergy filed suit against a colony of weevils for ravaging the vineyards of St. Julian. A lawyer was assigned to defend the insects, who argued that as creatures of God, they had a natural right to feed. The court, after deliberation, offered them an alternative. They were granted a plot of land outside the village where they might live undisturbed. When the insects failed to comply, the priests pronounced them cursed, sprinkling holy water upon the vines to drive them away. Whether it worked, no one recorded. These trials might seem comic, but they were expressions of a society obsessed with moral symmetry. When something terrible happened, when a child died, when crops failed, there had to be a reason, and therefore a culprit. The idea of pure accident was alien to the medieval worldview. To leave the deed unpunished was to invite spiritual contamination, a wound upon the community's soul. The law was not just about vengeance, it was about cleansing. Animal trials also served as a moral mirror for human behavior. By punishing beasts, the courts reinforced the notion that man was accountable to the same cosmic law. A murderer could see his own guilt reflected in the condemned pig. A thief might tremble as a goat was branded for stealing turnips. In the spectacle of punishment, everyone was reminded of sin and consequence. The animal's silence did not diminish the lesson, it amplified it. There were secular, as well as ecclesiastical animal trials. The secular courts, run by local lords or magistrates, dealt mostly with domestic animals accused of physical crimes, killings, injuries, or property damage. The ecclesiastical courts, belonging to the church, handled cases of supernatural or moral offense, such as heresy, blasphemy, or desecration. A rooster that laid an egg, a rare but possible event, was tried by the church for witchcraft, since roosters' eggs were believed to hatch demons or serpents. In Basel in 1474, such a rooster was solemnly condemned, burned at the stake, and its ashes scattered to the wind. Even the sea was not exempt. In Venice, sailors who blamed storms on disobedient dolphins or seabirds would sometimes demand that the animals be cursed by priests before setting sail again. In one chronicle, a dolphin was accused of dragging a child into the waves and was banished from the lagoon by proclamation of the dog's court. The sentence was read aloud to the empty waters, accompanied by the tolling of a bell. At times, entire species were condemned. In the 13th century, a swarm of caterpillars was excommunicated in Paris. In Spain, rats were ordered to leave the province of Navarre. In Germany, moles were put on trial for undermining dikes. Their defenders sometimes pleaded extenuating circumstances. One lawyer argued that rats could not appear in court because the cats that infest the town make travel perilous. The judge postponed the trial to allow safe passage, a gesture of fairness both ludicrous and sincere. These cases reveal something profound about the medieval mind. Law was not just a tool of governance, it was a sacred language that described how the world ought to be. Every crime was a breach in the moral fabric, and every judgment, no matter how absurd, was an attempt to mend it. When the priest cursed the beetles or the judge sentenced a pig, they were speaking to more than beasts. They were addressing the invisible order that held creation together. The punishments themselves were ritualistic. The execution of an animal might be followed by a sermon on sin. Its carcass might be buried at a crossroads, where the earth was thought to swallow impurity. Sometimes, the animal's hide was displayed as a warning, or its bones burned with incense to purify the air. The people watching did not see cruelty, they saw justice, the restoration of peace between man, beast, and God. Over time, as legal thought evolved and scientific reasoning took root, these trials began to fade. By the 17th century, they were relics of an older world. though echoes of them persisted in folk custom and superstition. The idea that nature itself could be guilty never truly vanished, it simply changed form. In the 19th century, farmers still spoke of cursing the locusts or blessing the fields, a vestige of the same ritual justice that once condemned pigs and roosters. Looking back, one might laugh at the image of a solemn judge reading Latin decrees to a herd of goats. But to the villagers who gathered beneath the church's shadow, it was deadly serious. Their world was one of fragile harmony, where every misfortune demanded meaning, every disaster a moral cause. To them, justice for animals was justice for the world. The courtroom was a theater of faith. Each verdict proclaimed that order could be restored, that chaos could be named and punished. And perhaps, in their own way, they were right, for the act of judging even absurdly gave them the comfort of control in a universe ruled by mystery. In the next part, we will leave the courtroom behind and step into the public square, where another kind of justice ruled. The punishments and executions that turned morality into spectacle pillories, stocks, and the ritual theater of shame that bound medieval villages together in fear and fascination. In the medieval village, justice was not a quiet thing. It was not hidden behind closed courtrooms or sealed documents. Justice was loud, visible, and unrelenting, a ritual of humiliation, a public theater that both terrified and fascinated. When a man or woman broke the law, the punishment was not simply meant to correct them. It was designed to remind everyone who watched what order meant and what chaos cost. For in that world, punishment was part of life's rhythm, just as surely as harvest and prayer. To live in the village was to live under the eyes of all, neighbors, priest, reeve, and God, and the eyes of all demanded spectacle. The pillory was perhaps the most recognizable instrument of this public justice. It stood in the marketplace or beside the churchyard, a wooden frame with holes for the head and hands. The condemned would be locked into it, exposed for hours or days, while the villagers gathered to stare, jeer, or worse. Rotten vegetables, mud, and dung were thrown freely. Children mocked, old women cursed, drunks laughed. Yet for all the cruelty, this was considered moral instruction. The sinner's shame was meant to wash away the village's fear. There were variations across Europe. In France, the carcan was an iron collar fixed to a wall or post. In Germany, the pranger stood in the town square, often bearing an inscription of the crime. In England, the pillory was sometimes fitted with sharp edges, cutting into the flesh if the prisoner struggled. To be still was to endure, to survive humiliation as penance. To fight was to bleed. Beside the pillory often stood its lesser cousin, the stocks. Here the legs, or sometimes both legs, and arms were clamped in place. The punishment was common for petty crimes, drunkenness, blasphemy, gambling, or missing Sunday Mass. Those locked in the stocks might sit all night in rain or frost, watched by villagers passing to morning prayers. The purpose was not just physical suffering but spiritual reflection. As one chronicler wrote, the body bends, and the soul is lifted. Sometimes, however, the crowd took justice into its own hands. A man in the stocks could be pelted with refuse or beaten to death before dawn, while the reeve looked away. Punishment, once public, had a life of its own. The thin line between law and vengeance blurred in the torchlight. Other devices served the same ritual of humiliation. The cucking stool, also called the ducking stool, was reserved for women accused of scolding, gossiping, or witchcraft. The offender was strapped into a wooden chair attached to a long beam, then swung out over a pond or river and plunged beneath the water. Each dunk was greeted with cheers. The cold, filthy water symbolized cleansing, though the cruelty often killed. The punishment was not private reformation but public purification, the village washing itself through her suffering. For men, there were different torments. A thief might be branded with a hot iron, the mark of his crime burned into his flesh. T for thief, M for murder. The branding was often done in the square, before a crowd singing psalms. Some marks were carved with knives rather than irons, a crude cut across the cheek, or a missing ear. These wounds were permanent testimonies, making sin visible to all. To walk through life with such a mark was to carry one's sentence forever. Execution itself was not always the worst fate. Death could be clean, disgrace could not. The most dreaded punishments were those that left the sinner alive but marked, scorned, and broken. In some regions, public flogging was common, the condemned stripped to the waist and lashed while walking a circuit through the village. Each stop represented a sin confessed, each lash a plea for forgiveness. Children followed, counting aloud, learning the wages of disobedience. The church intertwined itself deeply in these rituals. Before punishment, the priest might bless the instruments, the rope, the rod, the iron. Afterward, he would pray for the soul of the condemned. Justice and salvation walk hand in hand. In the village mind, suffering purged not only crime but sin. To endure punishment with humility was to cleanse the spirit. Some, like the thief who kissed the executioner's hand, were said to die as saints. But there was another side to this spectacle, one of hypocrisy and hidden pleasure. The same people who prayed for mercy often delighted in cruelty. Executions became carnivals. Markets swelled on hanging days, alehouses overflowed. Vendors sold cakes and wine near the gallows. Parents lifted their children onto their shoulders to see better. The condemned man's final words, if clever or defiant, might be repeated for years. The village, bound by law and faith, found release in the drama of punishment. Even the manner of execution carried meaning. Hanging was for common criminals, beheading for nobles. Burning was reserved for heretics, witches, or traitors, sins of the soul rather than the body. Drowning, a watery mirror of baptism, was for women who had shamed themselves or the community. In Germany, counterfeiters were boiled alive. In parts of Italy, blasphemers had their tongues torn out. Each punishment was not just penalty but symbol, a moral lesson written in flesh. The gallows stood often on a hill outside the village, visible from the fields. It was both warning and protection, the community's way of saying, "Here ends sin." The bodies of the hanged were left to rot, serving as a sermon for weeks. Ravens fed, children pointed, travelers crossed themselves. Some believed that to walk beneath the gallows brought luck, for the sins of others had drawn God's wrath away from the land. Others gathered relics from the dead, a hangman's rope, a finger bone, as charms against misfortune. The sacred and the grotesque intertwined seamlessly. Justice also had its festive forms. On feast days or harvest festivals, mock trials might be staged for comic sinners, the lazy worker, the boastful drunk. They would be tried by their peers, sentenced to carry a pig's bladder or wear a fool's cap. Laughter replaced cruelty, yet the lesson remained the same. No one stood above the law of custom. Even the innocent learned to fear the crowd's judgment. For those accused of heresy or witchcraft, however, there was no laughter. The church courts dealt in spiritual crimes, and their punishments were meant not to humiliate but to destroy. The accused might be tortured in secret before being handed to the secular arm for execution. The spectacle was no less public, but its tone was darker. Heretics were burned at crossroads, where four winds would carry their ashes. The crowd watched in silence, or sang hymns to drown out the screams. The fire was both justice and purification, the visible triumph of faith over the devil. In some places, the condemned were granted one last act of mercy, a confession shouted from the scaffold. To confess was to save the soul, even as the body perished. A man who repented might be strangled before burning. One who cursed God would be thrown alive into the flames. The distinction mattered deeply to those who watched. It proved that justice, however merciless, still sought redemption. The rituals of punishment extended beyond death. The bodies of executed criminals were sometimes denied burial in consecrated ground. Their corpses might be displayed, dismembered, or buried beneath crossroads, so that their souls would wander aimlessly and never return. Yet even this horror served a purpose. The villagers believed that by marking the dead as dead, They protected the living from contamination. The line between justice and magic blurred until it vanished. Not all who suffered were guilty. Many were scapegoats for misfortune. A poor man accused when the harvest failed, a stranger blamed for plague, a woman condemned for too much knowledge of herbs. Yet the rituals of punishment were so deeply woven into the fabric of life that doubt itself became dangerous. To question justice was to question God's will. So the villagers bowed their heads, made the sign of the cross, and told themselves that the world was clean again. And in a sense, it was. The spectacle purged fear, gave order to chaos, and reaffirmed the unity of the community. Each punishment was a performance of belief, a ritual of control in a world ruled by uncertainty. In the absence of reason, pain became meaning. But as centuries turned, as towns grew and kings centralized power, these local theaters of punishment began to fade. The gallows moved outside the walls. Executions became rarer, more regulated. Shame retreated from the marketplace into the courtroom. Yet echoes of that old spectacle remain even now, in the fascination with public trials, in the hunger for scandal, in the way crowds still gather when judgment is given. The medieval villagers did not invent cruelty. They simply made it sacred. Their punishments, strange and brutal, were mirrors of their fears, fear of sin, of chaos, of one another. And through those rituals of suffering, they believed they could hold the world together. In the next part, we step away from punishment and turn our gaze to another realm of strangeness, the laws of work, trade, and daily labor. For even the simplest acts of plowing, brewing, or baking were bound by intricate codes of justice, superstition, and control, rules that could make or break a life in the medieval village. In the medieval village, law was not something distant or abstract. It did not live only in scrolls or the mouths of judges. It was in the bread a woman baked, in the ale a man brewed, in the way a plow cut the soil. Every task of daily life, from working the fields to lighting the hearth, was watched, measured, and bound by ancient custom. For in that fragile, hungry world, even small mistakes could bring ruin, and small cheats could become crimes. The assize of bread and ale, decreed in England in the 13th century and mirrored by many similar village laws across Europe, was one of the most peculiar and important of these regulations. It governed two of life's sacred necessities, food and drink. Bread and ale were not just commodities, they were survival itself. To cheat in them was not merely dishonesty, it was betrayal of the entire community. Every village had its bread assizer, sometimes called the ale taster or ale conner, who patrolled the markets and taverns. He carried a wooden cup and a small knife, his tools of truth. With the cup, he sampled the brew. With the knife, he cut the loaf to test its weight. A baker whose bread was too light for its price, or a brewer whose ale was too weak or sour, could be fined, pilloried, or even flogged. In some villages, repeat offenders were forced to carry loaves or barrels through the streets, wearing a sign of their crime. The rules were detailed and unrelenting. The price of bread rose and fell with the cost of wheat, which was announced by the reeve after market day. The law dictated exactly how many loaves of a given weight should be sold for a penny. If a baker was caught giving short measure, his oven could be destroyed, the ultimate punishment, for it stripped him of his livelihood. Ale, too, was sacred. Brewing was often done by women, the alewives, who made small batches at home and sold them from their doors. They hung a bundle of straw, called the ale stake, above the entrance as a sign of fresh brew. But the ale taster's visit could change fortunes overnight. A sour brew, a dishonest measure, or an unlicensed sale might bring shame and ruin. Yet the law was as inconsistent as it was strict. A brewer favored by the lord or parish priest could often escape punishment, while widows and strangers bore the full brunt of it. And yet, despite its harshness, the law bound the village together. It created a shared rhythm, the price of bread, the quality of ale, the measure of work, all woven into the pulse of communal life. It gave order to hunger and meaning to survival. Beyond bread and ale, There were the labor laws, rules so intricate that to break them, even by accident, could bring swift retribution. Every serf owed his lord certain days of work on the demesne, the lord's fields, called week work and boon work. These were not merely duties, they were legal obligations, recorded in manorial rolls and enforced with precision. If a man failed to appear on his assigned day, his absence could be treated as theft, theft of labor owed, theft of time. A reeve or beadle might drag him before the manorial court. Excuses were rarely accepted, unless blessed by the priest. Even illness could be doubted, for the Lord's grain waited for no man. Labor itself was ritualized. The plowman could not begin before the church bell, nor stop before its evening toll. The Lord's oxen had priority on the village paths. A man who drove his plow over a boundary without permission could be fined for plow breach, a curious crime, but one that symbolized how land and law were fused. The harvest laws were among the strictest. When the time came to reap the Lord's wheat, all hands were required. Men, women, and even children took part, often under the watchful eye of the reeve or bailiff. A missing worker meant lost grain, and lost grain meant hunger. Punishments for absence could range from a fine to public shame, or worse, forced service during the next feast. The church, too, had its say in labor. No one could plow, sow, or spin on holy days. The calendar of saints and feasts structured the entire rhythm of work. To labor on a forbidden day was not just unlawful, it was sacrilegious. Yet these prohibitions were double-edged, for while they limited productivity, they also gave rest, and rest in the medieval world was a divine luxury. Trade laws, likewise, reached deep into the daily life of the village. The market was both opportunity and peril. Every transaction was watched by the market reeve, who ensured that measures were honest, weights true, and goods fit for sale. Scales were regularly checked, and those found false might be destroyed in the public square. In some regions, a merchant caught using false balance would be made to stand barefoot on the very scale he had tampered with, holding heavy stones until confession. Even crafts were bound by law. The village smith, for example, could not work on weapons without the Lord's permission. The miller, whose control of the mill made him both vital and suspect, was often watched most closely of all. Mills were magnets of suspicion, for they dealt in grain, the heart of survival. A dishonest miller could steal a handful of flour from each sack, and that small theft multiplied into misery. Many manorial rolls contain the same familiar accusation. The miller took too much toll. Millers were sometimes forced to swear oaths before the altar, promising to take only their due share. Yet tales of their deceit filled medieval literature. Sly, grinning men with white-dusted hands, forever cheating their neighbors. It was not merely a moral stereotype, but a reflection of real resentment. The mill was the most regulated, yet most distrusted, institution of the village. Taxes and tolls were laws of their own. To pass a bridge or cross a lord's land often required payment. Even gathering firewood from the forest was subject to intricate restrictions. A villager could take dead wood but not green wood. To mistake one for the other was to risk a fine or beating. Hunting the Lord's deer or even setting snares for rabbits could bring ruin. The infamous forest laws, harsh and absolute, made the king's trees more sacred than his peasants. And yet, the villagers were not without cunning. They found ways to twist the law, to bend it without breaking. A man might accidentally drop his sickle in the Lord's forest, and later retrieve it, carrying out an armful of branches in the process. A woman might brew ale too strong, claiming she had followed the same recipe but that God had blessed it more. These quiet rebellions were acts of survival, small victories in a system designed to bind. The village courts where such matters were judged were themselves strange and theatrical. The manorial court met in the open air, often beneath a great oak or near the churchyard cross. The villagers gathered, and the steward read the cases aloud. The accused stood before their peers, their neighbors, friends, and rivals, who served as jurors. Justice was communal, intimate, and often cruel. Fines were the most common punishment, paid in coin or goods. But where coin was scarce, the penalty might be labor, livestock, or even a symbolic act of penance. A woman accused of brewing false ale might be ordered to pour her own brew into the mud before the watching crowd. A man who plowed across a boundary might be forced to rebuild the hedge with his bare hands. These gestures carried moral weight. They restored balance, visible to all. Behind the formality of law was something older: custom, the true ruler of medieval life. Custom was the unwritten law, shaped by memory and repetition. It told when to plant, how to measure, whom to obey. A new lord might bring new laws, but he could not easily break custom. It has always been done thus, the villagers would say, and that was often enough to resist change. This web of regulation, at once suffocating and sustaining, created a paradox. It kept the village alive, yet trapped it in endless repetition. To live by law was to be safe, but never free. Every loaf, every drop of ale, every plow furrow was a small act of obedience, not only to the Lord, but to the very idea of order. And in that obedience lay both the strength and tragedy of the medieval peasant. For though he was bound by countless rules, he also understood something we have largely forgotten: that law was not merely an instrument of power, but a rhythm of life. It told the people how to live together, how to trust, how to share. In its cruelties, there was also a kind of fragile peace. In the next part, we turn to the laws of faith and superstition, the strange codes that govern belief, sin, and salvation. For in medieval Europe, the soul itself was subject to law, and breaking it could mean far more than prison or fine. It could mean eternal damnation. In the medieval world, sin was not a private matter. It was a public offense, a fracture in the spiritual order that bound heaven and earth. Just as the village had its reeves and bailiffs to keep worldly peace, so too did the church wield its own machinery of justice, courts, judges, oaths, and punishments, to maintain divine order. To live in medieval Europe was to live under two overlapping systems of law: one of the body ruled by lords and kings, and one of the soul ruled by priests and bishops. The church's law, canon law, reached into every corner of life. It governed marriage, birth, death, and even thought. A villager might never travel beyond his parish boundaries, yet he was subject to laws written in Latin in faraway Rome. It was said that no man may live outside the law of the church, and indeed, even silence or ignorance could be guilt. Sin was treated as crime because the soul was a kind of citizen in a cosmic kingdom. To confess was not merely to repent, but to stand trial before God. The confessional became a courtroom in miniature. The sinner as defendant, the priest as judge, the penance as sentence. Some sins demanded only prayer or fasting, but others, heresy, witchcraft, sacrilege, could lead to imprisonment, torture, or death. In this way, faith and law became inseparable. The village priest was both spiritual shepherd and moral constable. He spied, instructed, and reported. He recorded marriages and baptisms, marked who attended Mass and who did not. A villager who missed church without cause might face fine or public rebuke. One who spoke blasphemy could be forced to stand before the altar, barefoot, holding a candle of shame. The church's obsession with moral purity extended to thought itself. Heresy, the crime of holding belief contrary to doctrine, was the most feared of all. It was treason against heaven. To the medieval mind, heresy was not opinion but infection, a disease of the soul that could spread like plague. Therefore, the response was brutal. The heretic must be purged. From the 12th century onward, inquisitors were sent into towns and villages to seek out heresy. These were not the wild torturers of later legend, at least not always, but learned clerics, trained in law and logic, who questioned witnesses and recorded testimonies. Their tools were words and fear. They summoned villagers to swear oaths of truth, and once sworn, no lie could be uttered without perjury before God. In villages touched by rumor, Inquisitors would post notices calling on all to confess voluntarily. Those who came forward might receive lighter penance. Those who resisted were branded obstinate. And obstinacy, in the medieval imagination, was the seed of damnation. The penances themselves were often public, for sin demanded spectacle. A man who had blasphemed might be ordered to crawl on his knees through the churchyard, reciting prayers. A woman accused of pride might have her hair cut and be dressed in sackcloth for a season. Adulterers were paraded through the streets with ropes around their necks. Repentance had to be seen to be believed. The fear of excommunication hung over every soul like a shadow. To be excommunicated was not merely to be expelled from church. It was to be cut off from the community of the living and the dead. One could not receive sacraments, marry, or be buried in consecrated ground. The village would shun the excommunicate. No one dared trade with him, speak to him, or even share food. His house might be marked with ash, his tools left to rust. In a world where salvation was social as well as spiritual, excommunication was a living death. It was not only individuals who could suffer it. Entire towns could be placed under interdict, a kind of spiritual quarantine. When a king or lord defied the church, the pope might punish his realm by silencing the sacraments. Bells would stop ringing, marriages could not be blessed, the dead could not be buried. Imagine a village in silence, no mass, no confession, no tolling for the dead. The people would feel as if heaven itself had turned away, and when at last the interdict was lifted, they would celebrate like souls returned from the grave. But it was not only belief that fell under the church's jurisdiction. Even bodily acts were judged as sins with legal precision. The confessional manuals of the Middle Ages read like intricate codes, detailing every possible violation of purity and its prescribed penance. There were fines of fasting days for lustful thoughts, for impure touches, for unholy laughter. For every passion of the body, there was a corresponding law of the spirit. The church's reach extended into marriage, which was considered both a sacrament and a contract. It could not be dissolved, save by death or by the Pope's rare dispensation. Marriages made without witnesses or parental consent might be declared invalid. Unions between cousins could bring scandal and investigation. The church kept detailed records of who could marry whom, tracing bloodlines to avoid forbidden kinship. And when disputes arose over dowries, adultery, or legitimacy, they were heard in the ecclesiastical courts. These courts were among the most sophisticated of the medieval world, staffed by clerics trained in law, but their rulings could shatter lives. A woman declared adulteress could lose her children, her home, and her soul's safety. A man found guilty of breaking a betrothal might be ordered to pay lifelong compensation, not for breach of promise, but for endangering another's purity. The fear of hell was the ultimate enforcement. Every sermon, every confession, every punishment reminded the people that sin was not only punished in this world but in the next. Hell was not abstract, it was painted on church walls, carved into cathedral doors, described in detail by preachers. Flames, chains, demons. These were not metaphors but realities as solid as the soil. The law of God had its eternal prison. Even natural events were moralized. A drought could be seen as punishment for the village's pride, a plague as retribution for secret sins. The priest would call for fasting and prayer, for repentance and processions through the fields. Law became ritual, and ritual became survival. The community confessed as one, hoping to lift divine wrath. Among the most haunting examples of faith-turned law were the sumptuary laws of morality. The church and local councils often regulated what people could wear, not only by class but by moral standing. Prostitutes might be forced to wear yellow hoods. Widows could be required to dress only in black. Even in clothing, sin was displayed, confessed, and contained. And yet, for all its severity, this spiritual legal system offered one profound mercy, forgiveness. However dark the sin, penance could restore the soul. The priest, holding the power of absolution, was both judge and healer. For every confession, there was a promise that order could be restored, that the soul could find peace again. In this, perhaps, lies the strange beauty of medieval law. It sought harmony in all things, even in punishment. Every whip stroke, every public shame, every prayer recited on bleeding knees was meant not only to hurt but to heal. The villagers believed that by confessing, by suffering, by obeying, they might balance the scales of heaven. In the next part, we will explore the laws of superstition and the occult, how belief itself became dangerous, and how the same society that punished heresy also feared the touch of unseen forces. The devil, the witch, the charm, all were subjects of law, and in their trials we glimpsed the shadow of medieval imagination at its darkest. In the medieval village, the unseen world was not separate from the real one. It pressed close, breathing through every shadow and whisper. To the people of the time, invisible forces ruled as surely as kings and priests did. Disease, love, misfortune, fertility, all were thought to hinge on the will of spirits, saints, or demons. And because the medieval world was ordered by law, even the supernatural came under its jurisdiction. There were rules for magic, punishments for witchcraft, and legal rituals for driving out the devil. Long before the witch trials of the later centuries, medieval Europe already had laws to restrain the mysterious. The earliest were not about witches, but sorcerers, those who used knowledge or ritual to bend nature. The Church condemned such acts in principle, yet tolerated certain forms when baptized by faith. A farmer who blessed his plow with a prayer was devout. A farmer who muttered over it in secret was suspect. A woman who brewed herbs for healing could be wise, unless her medicine worked too well or too strangely. Then she was a witch. The line between holy and unholy was perilously thin. The Church itself practiced what might look like magic, relics that cured, saints' bones that healed, holy water that warded off evil. But those miracles were lawful because they flowed from divine grace. Anything outside that channel, any power not sanctioned by priest or scripture, was seen as rebellion against heaven. And rebellion, in the medieval mind, was always the devil's work. The earliest written laws against witchcraft came from the Carolingian capitularies in the 8th and 9th centuries. They forbade belief in night-flying women and pagan rites, not because those things were real, but because belief in them was heretical. To think that witches could control nature was, in itself, sin. Yet as centuries passed, that logic inverted. By the 13th century, Church and state agreed that witches were real and therefore punishable. The crime had shifted from false belief to diabolical conspiracy. In the villages, however, witchcraft was less about theology and more about survival. People turned to charms and amulets because the world was perilous and medicine uncertain. A charm for cows to give milk, a blessing for childbirth, a knot of red thread to keep away fever. These were not seen as evil but necessary. Yet when disasters struck, when milk soured, or a child sickened, or a storm ruined crops, suspicion fell on those who dealt in such powers. Law followed fear, and fear was plentiful. The local courts handled most accusations. The process was a grim echo of normal justice. The accuser swore an oath before the village, naming the witch and describing the harm done. The accused was summoned, often trembling, to answer. Proof was nearly impossible, so the court relied on ordeals or oaths. A woman might be ordered to plunge her arm into boiling water. If she emerged unscathed, she was innocent. A man might be bound and thrown into a pond. If he floated, the water, pure and holy, had rejected him, marking guilt. These were not random tortures, but rituals of cosmic logic. To the villagers, God would not allow injustice. If the accused were innocent, the water would protect them. If guilty, it would condemn. And so, each trial was a prayer disguised as punishment. By the late Middle Ages, the witch had become not just a village healer gone astray, but a servant of Satan, part of a vast, invisible conspiracy. This change was fed by scholars and clerics who sought to codify evil. The most infamous of these was the Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, published in 1487 by the inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. It described witchcraft as a heresy that must be eradicated by law. It taught judges how to interrogate, how to torture, how to extract confession, and above all, how to recognize the devil's mark. But even before that book, the seeds of fear had taken root. Village laws began to mirror ecclesiastical ones. In France, Germany, and England, local courts issued decrees against cursing, using spells, or consulting the dead. A woman who kept too many herbs, who spoke to herself, or who lived alone near the woods might find herself accused. Her neighbors would whisper that she had the evil eye, that she had blighted their wheat or killed their chickens with a glance. Some of the most detailed records of these laws come from small manorial courts in Normandy and Flanders. They tell of women fined for divining lost goods or calling spirits of the night. One entry from 1324 in the town of Le Mans describes a man condemned for making a wax image of his enemy, a form of sympathetic magic. He was ordered to burn the image publicly, to recite the creed 3 times, and to fast for a week. Law and superstition intertwined so tightly that one could scarcely tell where faith ended and fear began. Even animals could become instruments of the supernatural. Cats, particularly black ones, were accused of being witches' familiars. The same church that once blessed cats for killing vermin now cursed them as accomplices of Satan. Village ordinances forbade keeping too many cats. Some required them to be killed before Easter. On St. John's Eve, cats were burned in bonfires, a purification. They called it. Amulets and charms were similarly policed. A cross worn for faith was sacred. The same cross hung upside down or carved with strange letters was criminal. In some places, priests themselves collected forbidden charms and destroyed them during Lent, preaching sermons against the secret magic of the ignorant. Yet these same priests might bless fields, candles, or water, acts that, in another context, were hardly different. The boundary between miracle and magic was porous, and the law walked its edge with an ease. The most terrifying cases were those involving the pact with the devil. The idea that a person might sell their soul in exchange for power was not new. It came from ancient legends, but in the later Middle Ages it became a legal category. A confession of such a pact, however obtained, sealed the fate of the accused. No lawyer could defend a soul that had willingly betrayed heaven. The punishment was fire, for only fire could purify such evil. The Inquisition sometimes intervened, but most witch trials were local affairs, carried out by secular courts under pressure from the community. The people wanted justice or vengeance. A witch's conviction often brought relief, her execution, a sense of cleansing. The smoke rising from the pyre was both sacrifice and spectacle. It reassured the living that order had been restored. And yet, beneath this cruelty lay something deeply human, fear of chaos, fear of the unknown. The medieval world was bound by faith, but haunted by mystery. Every rule of magic, every law against sorcery, was an attempt to make sense of the inexplicable. When the harvest failed or the plague struck, it was easier to blame a witch than to face the randomness of fate. Law became a shield against terror. Still, there were those who resisted. Some priests defended accused women, arguing that the devil could not act without God's will, and that such trials were superstition. In some places, local lords forbade the killing of witches without solid proof, but reason was fragile, and fear stronger. The night was full of sounds that no law could silence. In the end, the medieval laws of the supernatural reveal as much about belief as about justice. They show a world where everything, even evil, had to be named, categorized, and punished. For in naming, there was safety. In ritual, there was order. The villagers lived between heaven and hell, governed by priests on one side and judges on the other, each claiming to speak for truth. And in that narrow space, Between fear and faith, the medieval imagination created its darkest and most enduring stories. In the next part, we will turn from witchcraft to laws of death and the afterlife, how medieval villages governed burial, mourning, and the restless dead. For, in a world obsessed with salvation, even the grave was a place of law. Death in the medieval village was not a private affair. It was a legal, spiritual, and communal event that bound the living and the dead together under the watchful eyes of both church and custom. The moment a person drew their last breath, law awoke, the laws of inheritance, of burial, of mourning, and even of the body's journey to the grave. For to the medieval mind, death was not an end, but a passage, and like all passages, it required order, ritual, and the approval of authority. When a villager died, the first duty was to notify the priest. The church claimed immediate jurisdiction over the soul, and, by extension, over the body. Without a priest's blessing, a burial could not be lawful. The priest would come to the home, bearing holy water and candles, reciting prayers to drive away demons. The family was forbidden to move the corpse until the priest had confirmed death and performed the last rites. To bury a body in secret was a grave offense, punishable by fine or excommunication. The body was then washed, usually by women, and wrapped in a shroud of linen. But even this act was subject to law. The shroud could not be of silk or dyed cloth, for sumptuary laws forbade extravagance in death as in life. All are equal in the earth, said the church, and even the rich were reminded that they could not buy dignity in the grave. In England and France, the Woolen Acts required that corpses be buried in plain wool, a strange combination of morality and economy meant to support local trade while discouraging vanity. The funeral procession was a legal ritual in itself. Bells tolled, candles burned, and the villagers followed the coffin through the streets. To block or insult a funeral was a crime, violation of the dead, and those who refused to join the procession might be fined. It was the village's duty to bear witness, for every death was a communal loss. The burial ground, consecrated by the church, was holy law made visible. No one could be buried outside it without permission. To rest beyond its boundary was to be cut off from the prayers of the living, doomed to wander as a restless soul. Suicides, heretics, excommunicates, and unbaptized infants were denied Christian burial. Their bodies were often interred at crossroads, where for paths met the intersection of worlds, where spirits might be confused and lose their way back to the living. These were not mere superstitions. They were codified rules enforced by both ecclesiastical and manorial courts. A priest who buried a sinner in hallowed ground could lose his post. Families who tried to bribe the clergy for such favors faced public shame. In some villages, the graveyard was inspected annually to ensure that boundaries were respected. Even the bones of the dead were regulated by law. Yet within those boundaries, hierarchy still ruled. The rich were buried near the church walls or even within the nave itself, their tombs marked by carvings and candles. The poor lay farther away, their graves unmarked, their names forgotten. But even there, law made distinctions. A man who had died in a state of sin might be buried sideways, or his coffin turned to face away from the altar. In some places, his grave was sprinkled with ash instead of holy water, a silent judgment written in sorrow. The church's control extended beyond burial to mourning. Mourning itself was legislated. Widows were expected to wear black for a full year to avoid remarriage until the mourning period ended, and to abstain from public festivity. Breaking these customs could lead to moral accusation, even trial. In certain towns, widows who remarried too soon were forced to appear in court, accused of disrespecting the dead and defiling the memory of marriage. There were also rules about wakes, the night vigils held before burial. These were meant to be solemn, filled with prayer and psalms. But as the night wore on, wakes often turned into gatherings of food, drink, and song, half celebration, half defiance of death. The church repeatedly condemned such behavior. Synods in France, Germany, and England issued decrees forbidding games or drinking near the dead, warning that laughter among corpses invited demons. Yet the custom persisted. The people needed to celebrate life even as they mourned. In the manorial records of 14th century England, we find fines imposed for indecent conduct at a wake, dancing dice, even flirtation. A strange contradiction. The same society that feared death also refused to let it silence joy. The wake was both a farewell and a rebellion. The laws of inheritance began the moment the body was laid to rest. The eldest son might claim the land, but not without formal acknowledgement in court. The reeve and villagers gathered to witness the new heir's oath, while the priest recorded tithes owed to the church for the funeral. The widow's rights were carefully defined. She might keep 1/3 of her husband's estate, but only if she remained chaste and of good fame. If she remarried too quickly or was accused of sin, she could lose her portion. Even love, it seemed, was governed by the shadow of law. The church also laid claim to the dead man's mortuary, a fee paid from his estate to the parish, often in the form of his best animal or garment. It was said to be payment for prayers for his soul, but many saw it as another tax. Refusing the mortuary could bring accusations of sacrilege. In one 15th century case, a widow in Burgundy who withheld a cow owed as a mortuary was summoned before the bishop's court and ordered to make restitution lest her husband's soul suffer in purgatory. Purgatory itself, that vast middle ground between salvation and damnation, had its own legal order. The living could intercede for the dead by prayer, fasting, or donation. This created an entire economy of salvation, where law and commerce intertwined. A man might endow a candle to burn for his soul each year, or pay for a monk to recite masses in perpetuity. The church kept meticulous records of these transactions, ensuring that spiritual contracts were fulfilled. But even the dead were not entirely safe from legal trouble. Graves could be disturbed by lawsuits. Disputes over land sometimes unearthed bones, families argued over burial rights, and courts were called to decide who owned a plot of consecrated ground. In some places, exhumation was ordered as punishment. A heretic's body might be dug up and burned years after death, as if the law could reach into the afterlife itself. The most famous case was that of Pope Formosus, whose corpse was exhumed in 897 and put on trial. The infamous cadaver synod, his body dressed in papal robes, was placed on a throne and interrogated by a living pope. The verdict, guilty of unlawful ambition. The corpse was stripped and thrown into the Tiber. Even death could not shield the disobedient from justice. For ordinary villagers, however, the fear was simpler, the fear of becoming one of the restless dead. Folklore and church doctrine met here in an easy union. Those who died unconfessed, unburied, or cursed might rise to haunt the living. Their return was not only a horror but a legal irregularity, for the dead were supposed to remain within the church's control. Local priests were sometimes ordered to perform exorcisms of the grave, blessing the ground anew or placing relics within the coffin. These acts were as much legal as spiritual. They reasserted divine authority over what had slipped into chaos. In Eastern Europe, written decrees survive against the strigoi and vampiric revenants, the dead who walked. In Western Christendom, similar fears took form in stories of ghosts who demanded repayment of debts or fulfillment of vows. The church answered with law. The dead, too, must have their justice. If a ghost appeared, the priest might hold an inquest, questioning witnesses and performing rites to release the soul. The haunting was treated as a case, another dispute to be settled in the court of God. And so, even in death, the medieval villager remained entangled in rules, oaths, and judgments. The grave was not freedom, but a new jurisdiction. The priest and the law followed into the edge of eternity. In the next part, we will explore how these ideas of divine order and earthly control shaped the laws of crime and punishment, the brutal theater of medieval justice, where guilt was confessed not only with words but with blood. In a medieval village, justice was not a silent principle written in parchment, it was a spectacle. It lived in the clang of the blacksmith's hammer forging shackles, in the cries from the pillory, in the tolling of bells that called witnesses to the square. To commit a crime was not merely to break a rule, it was to tear the fabric of divine order. Every offense, no matter how small, echoed as an insult to God, the Lord of the manor, and the fragile peace of the community. The punishment, then, was never private. It was loud, visible, and unforgettable. At the heart of every village lay its court leet or manorial court, presided over by the Lord's steward. Once or twice a year, the villagers gathered in the hall or even beneath a great oak to hear the roll of offenses. The reeve called names, the bailiff fetched the accused, and the jury of free tenants, men who owed service to the manor, gave their verdict. There was no lawyer, no trained judge. The wisdom of custom was the law, and memory was its archive. Most offenses were petty: failure to maintain fences, selling spoiled ale, letting livestock stray into the Lord's meadows, neglecting the repair of bridges. But each breach carried weight. Disorder in one household could lead to disorder in all. The manorial records from 13th century Norfolk show fines for crimes as minor as throwing filth into the lane, speaking insult to a neighbor, or quarreling in church. Yet these were not trivial to medieval eyes. They were sparks that might ignite feuds, bloodshed, and scandal. Punishment was crafted to teach. The most common was the amercement, a fine measured not in coins alone but in reputation. The offender stood before his peers as the steward pronounced a sum, often accompanied by a warning: let it be amended or let worse follow. But when money could not restore order, the punishment became physical. The pillory stood at the crossroads or beside the market, its wooden frame waiting for sinners. There, the baker who cheated customers, or the butcher who sold spoiled meat, was locked by head and hands for all to see. Rotten vegetables, mud, and insults flew from the crowd. To be shamed was often worse than to be whipped. Your name became a proverb for deceit. A single day in the pillory could stain a family for generations. Beside it, the stocks held lesser offenders, drunkards, gossips, and idlers. Children mocked them, dogs licked their boots, and time crawled like a punishment itself. In some places, lovers found kissing in public were locked together in the same stocks, a punishment half cruel, half comic. More severe crimes met the cucking stool, a chair fastened to a long beam, used for dunking offenders into a pond or river. It was reserved especially for scolds, women accused of loudness, quarrels, or slander. The symbolism was cruelly gendered: water to cool the tongue, humiliation to cleanse the mouth. The villagers gathered to laugh as the stool dipped and rose. Each splash was a lesson. Silence was safety. Then there was the whipping post, used for thieves, vagabonds, and repeat offenders. Stripped to the waist, they received lashes counted aloud by the bailiff. The priest might stand nearby, urging repentance. In some regions, the law allowed a condemned thief to choose between lashes and exile. Yet many chose the whip, preferring visible pain to the hopeless wandering that exile meant. For greater crimes, murder, arson, heresy, treason, the spectacle grew darker. In the small towns, gallows were raised just beyond the gates, visible from the road. They reminded all who entered that law ruled here. Execution days drew crowds from miles away. Bakers sold bread, peddlers hawked charms, and children perched on walls to watch. Death, too, was community theater. The hanging of a thief followed ritual, confession, prayer, and a slow procession led by the parish bell. The condemned was urged to forgive his accusers. Sometimes he wore a paper crown inscribed with his crime. When the trap opened, silence fell, then a murmur of relief. The world had been cleansed. The body might hang for days, warning others who passed. But not all crimes met the noose. In some German and French villages, a thief might be mutilated, his ears cut off, his hand branded, his nose slit. The mark was both punishment and passport. Wherever he went, he carried his crime on his skin. In England, Branding on the cheek or thumb was common. A letter T for thief, B for blasphemer burned forever into flesh. Justice was not only about retribution, it was about balance. The medieval mind believed that wrong created imbalance between heaven and earth, and that suffering, whether through fine, pain, or shame, restored harmony. A man whipped before his neighbors was not only punished, he was purified. Pain was proof that the world still worked. Some punishments, however, drifted into the realm of the absurd. In one French village, a man who insulted the miller was ordered to crawl around the church 3 times on his knees, carrying a sack of flour. In another, a woman who mocked a priest had to kiss the church door in front of the congregation. Law and ritual merged with performance. The purpose was not only to punish but to teach through laughter and fear. Ordeals by fire, by water, by combat were the most dramatic form of justice, where divine judgment itself was invoked. Though largely abolished by the 13th century, they lingered in local memory. A man accused of theft might plunge his hand into boiling water. If his wand healed clean, he was innocent. A woman suspected of witchcraft might be bound and thrown into a pond. If she floated, it was proof that water rejected her sin. The logic was circular but unshakable. God, people believed, would reveal the truth through pain. In some English parishes, ordeals were replaced by compurgation, or oath-swearing. The accused would swear innocence before God, and the circle of neighbors, the oath-helpers, would repeat his words. Their honor became his shield. To refuse oath or helpers was to confess guilt by silence. A village's entire social trust could hinge on such rituals. When justice became uncertain, sanctuary offered a final refuge. Anyone who reached the church door and grasped the iron ring was protected for 40 days. Inside, the fugitive lived under the eyes of God, forbidden to leave. Priests brought bread and water. Villagers watched in awe. Some confessed and submitted to exile, walking barefoot to the nearest port to begin a life elsewhere. Others slipped away in the night, trusting in the mercy of distance. Sanctuary laws balanced vengeance with compassion, a reminder that even divine wrath had boundaries. The most curious punishments of all were those that turned the law into theater. A miller might be forced to host a feast for the village as restitution. A liar might carry a stone from sunrise to sunset. A poacher could be ordered to feed the Lord's dogs for a year. These strange remedies were not arbitrary, they were moral allegories, linking punishment to the nature of the crime. For women, the punishments often carried deeper humiliation. The skull's bridle, a metal cage fitted over the head with a tongue clamp, silenced those accused of gossip or defiance. The condemned woman was paraded through the streets, bells ringing from the bridle's frame. Her silence was both physical and symbolic, a restoration of patriarchal peace. To remove the bridle early was itself a punishable act of rebellion. There were 2 punishments that sought to heal. In some northern villages, reconciliations were arranged between quarreling families. The wrongdoer would kneel at the church porch, offering bread and salt to his victim as the priest blessed their peace. The act was as binding as any written charter. Medieval justice was harsh, but it also understood that peace required ritual, not just pain. As the centuries passed, these village laws began to fade beneath royal authority. The manorial courts lost power, professional judges replaced the reeve and steward. But the memory of local justice lingered in folklore, in proverbs, and in the architecture of the old pillories still standing in market squares. To modernize, medieval punishment seems cruel, absurd, and primitive. Yet to those who lived it, justice was sacred theater, a performance that reaffirmed the fragile contract between the human and the divine. Law was not an abstract system. It was a rhythm, a ritual, and a reminder that sin must be seen and order must be shown. In the next part, we will move from the spectacle of pain to the quiet power of belief and superstition, the strange laws that bound the unseen world to the visible one, where dreams, omens, and curses could carry the same weight as any royal decree. In medieval Europe, law did not end where reason began to fade. Beyond the visible punishments, fines, and edicts, there lay another kind of order, an invisible code that governed the unseen world. To the villagers who lived by candlelight, shadows were not empty. They were alive, whispering, watching, and sometimes judging. The church claimed that only God could rule over souls. But in the corners of every village, in barns and cottages and forest clearings, there existed another system of law, the law of superstition. This was not written in charters or decrees, yet it was every bit as binding. A farmer would rather defy the reeve than offend the spirit of the crossroads. A woman would rather face the steward's wrath than forget to leave bread for the household spirit on winter's eve. In the medieval village, breaking these laws could bring misfortune as real as any legal penalty. Sick cattle, failed harvests, barren lawns, and haunted nights. The church fought tirelessly to suppress such customs, labeling them pagan remnants. But superstition was stubborn. People did not see it as rebellion. They saw it as survival. While priests thundered about damnation from the pulpit, old women whispered older prayers, invoking saints and spirits in the same breath. They spoke of the hidden law that ruled the winds, the seasons, and the fate of men. Take, for example, the law of the threshold. No villager would step over a doorway without pausing, for it was said that spirits lingered there. A bride entering her new home was carried across so her luck would not stumble. To move a corpse over a threshold without blessing was forbidden. It invited death to return. These were not idle tales. They were rules enforced by fear and tradition. Then there was the law of the dead man's candle. If a candle flickered blue, it meant a spirit was near. If it went out suddenly, a death would follow within 3 days. Villagers would make the sign of the cross, whisper a prayer, and open the door to let the soul depart. Failure to do so might trap the spirit indoors, leading to misfortune. A steward or priest who ignored such omens risked more than ridicule. He risked the people's trust. Even the natural world obeyed secret codes. The oak, ash, and thorn were sacred trees. To cut one without proper words was to court disaster. Entire lawsuits arose from such acts, though no charter recorded the crime. In some English manors, villagers accused neighbors of cutting the fairy tree or disturbing the barrow of the ancestors. The courts, unsure how to rule, sometimes fined both sides, one for destruction, the other for blasphemy. The church, seeing how deeply superstition gripped the people, sought to transform it rather than erase it. Holy water replaced river charms, saints replaced spirits, and feast days replaced the old festivals. Yet beneath the surface, the old laws lived on. Villagers still placed bread for the wandering dead on All Souls' Night. They still tied ribbons to holy wells, praying for healing. In Spain, they whispered to St. Martha as if she were a goddess. In Ireland, they left milk for the good people in the hills. The line between crime and superstition blurred dangerously when fear turned to accusation. The witch trials of the later Middle Ages were born not from learned theology, but from village suspicion, the belief that someone somewhere had broken the secret laws of nature. A cow's milk turned sour, a child fell ill, or a storm destroyed crops, and the villagers whispered, "Someone has called the devil." The church had long condemned sorcery, but only in the 15th century did witchcraft become a crime of heresy, punishable by death. Before that, it was a matter for local courts, and punishments were often symbolic: a penance, a public confession, or a pilgrimage. Yet even in earlier centuries, fear of malefic magic lingered. In some villages, accused witches were made to walk the boundaries of their home carrying a burning candle, reciting psalms while the crowd watched. If the candle went out, it was said the devil had claimed them. More curious still were the laws of confession by ordeal of silence. A suspected witch or sorcerer would be isolated, forbidden from speaking for 3 days. If she broke her silence at night, it meant the spirits demanded her voice and she was guilty. Many confessed simply out of terror. Others endured, and their silence became proof of innocence. The system was cruel, but it reflected a deep medieval logic that truth could be drawn from suffering. Superstition also governed marriage, childbirth, and death. No child was to be baptized after sunset, lest the devil claim its shadow. No marriage was to take place during Lent, when demons roamed freely. A newborn's cradle must face east, toward the rising sun, and its first tooth must be rubbed with bread blessed on Easter. These were not mere habits, they were laws enforced by community shame. To ignore them was to invite suspicion, even accusation. In parts of Germany and Scandinavia, there existed the belief in the night court, an invisible gathering of spirits who judged the deeds of the living. Shepherds, for they heard it in the hills, the sound of bells and hoofbeats, the murmur of voices calling names. The condemned souls who had lied, stolen, or broken vows were shed to march forever, as the wild hunt. To see them was both a curse and a warning. Villagers marked doors with crosses and stayed indoors on stormy nights. Some of the strangest laws concerned omens and divination. To predict the future was a sin, yet many villages appointed unofficial seers, old men or women believed to read signs in fire, water, or flight of birds. The church tolerated them if their words upheld morality, but punished them harshly if they questioned divine will. One record from 1324 tells of a wise woman of Coventry fined for foretelling a lord's death by looking into a bowl of ink. The court charged her not with sorcery, but with disturbing the peace of the soul. The law of the bow governed the boundary between light and darkness. At sunset, the curfew bell rang to signal not only the closing of shops, but the sealing of doors against spirits. After that, no one was to wander. To be caught outside after curfew was to risk more than arrest. You risked being mistaken for a ghost. Priests recited the Hail Mary of nightfall, and candles were blessed to keep demons from entering through cracks or windows. In Italy, a curious custom called the blessing of the crossroads survived into the Renaissance. On certain nights, villagers carried torches to where roads met, reciting psalms to drive away the souls of suicides buried there. It was a mix of law and superstition, church and folk magic, and the parish priest often led it himself. The ceremony reminded everyone that law extended even to the forgotten dead. Yet superstition was not only about fear, it was about protection. Amulets were legal property, passed down in wills. A charm written in Latin could be worth as much as a cow. In some French villages, selling false charms was an offense punished by public confession. The irony was striking. The church forbade magic, yet the courts punished those who faked it. Even deceit in the unseen world required regulation. The hidden laws of superstition made the medieval village both fragile and enduring. They gave meaning to the unknown, structure to chaos, and comfort to suffering. A man who prayed to the Virgin and left milk for the fairies broke no law that mattered to him. He was obeying both heaven and earth. When the Reformation came, and with it the rise of new theology, these invisible laws began to fade. But they did not die. Even in the 17th century, people whispered charms in barns and wore herbs against the evil eye. Law could move to the king's court, but fear and faith stayed in the cottage. In the next part, we will see how these ancient superstitions and rituals began to merge with the emerging world of written codes and royal justice, how the village's invisible laws slowly transformed into the moral framework of a new Europe, and how the echoes of those shadows still haunt the modern world. As the medieval centuries drew toward their close, the world that had once seemed eternal began to tremble. The thatched villages that had governed themselves by custom and superstition for generations found their small laws eclipsed by a greater authority, the king's peace. Where once the reeve, the priest, and the elder had spoken judgment beneath a tree, now the royal clerk arrived with wax seals, Latin scrolls, and soldiers to enforce the word of distant monarchs. The rhythms of local life, so long shaped by harvest, faith, and fear of spirits, began to yield to a colder, broader order. The idea of the king's peace was simple in theory but revolutionary in effect. It declared that every subject of the crown lived under the protection and the control of the monarch. To disturb that peace was no longer merely a local matter. It was an affront to the realm itself. Crimes once punished by the pillory or the cucking stool were now tried before royal justices. The village gallows gave way to the king's courts. The laughter and terror of communal justice began to fade into parchment records and official seals. Yet the transition was not immediate. For centuries, both systems lived side by side, overlapping like layers of time. The steward still held his court late each autumn, calling villagers to swear that all is well and true. They fined neighbors for broken hedges and disorderly tongues. Even as royal officers rode through collecting taxes for wars no peasant understood, the people of the land obeyed both the old laws of belonging and the new laws of empire. With royal justice came uniformity, and with it, alienation. A man could once stand before his lord, explain his fault, and find forgiveness. Now he stood before strangers who spoke in formal tones and wrote in Latin. Fines increased, mercy became scarce. The old village punishments, for all their cruelty, had been personal and public. The new justice was distant, faceless, and often deadly. A thief who once lost an ear might now lose his life. The church, too, began to lose its monopoly on the moral order. The growth of secular law weakened the authority of priests to impose penance or excommunication. Confession no longer erased debt or crime. Courts required proof, not repentance. The soul could be cleansed by prayer, but the body still belonged to the state. For many villagers, this was a kind of spiritual exile. They could no longer appeal to saints or spirits for justice. They had to face the silence of bureaucracy. Still, the church fought to preserve its influence. Bishops issued decrees forbidding secular interference in holy matters. Parish priests continued to bless fields, ring bells against storms, and keep the parishioners' secrets. Even as royal courts spread, many villagers preferred to settle disputes through compromise at the church door, where bread and salt sealed peace more surely than any charter. But time was turning. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the 14th century, shattered faith in both church and custom. Whole villages vanished. Laws that had bound generations were buried with their makers. Labor shortages gave peasants new bargaining power, and the rigid hierarchies of feudal order began to loosen. In England, the peasants' revolt of 1381 cried out not only for lower taxes, but for justice that could be understood, not dictated by unseen lords. The rebels burned records and destroyed court rolls, shouting, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" For a brief moment, even the king's peace trembled. After the plague years, new legal minds rose in universities and royal courts. They sought to rationalize what had once been instinctive. Canon law, common law, Roman law each claimed to speak for truth. The village's oral traditions became curiosities, recorded in Latin by scholars who half believed, half mocked them. The manorial court's records, once written on scraps of parchment, were bound into books and stored in monasteries. Law was no longer lived, it was archived. Yet the old ways died hard. In remote places, mountain villages of the Alps, forest hamlets in Bohemia, island glens in Scotland, the shadow of the old law lingered. Local councils met by torchlight swore oaths over bread and wine, and invoked the Virgin and the fairies alike. There, the king's peace was a rumor. The old gods, half forgotten, still whispered in the wind. The enforcement of royal law often relied on symbolic gestures. A sheriff would ride into a village, read aloud a royal proclamation, and nail it to the church door. Whether anyone could read it mattered little. The act itself made the law real. Some villagers crossed themselves when they saw the seal, fearing that such documents carried the power of sorcery. To defy a sealed decree was unthinkable. It was as if the king himself stood in judgment. As the 15th century advanced, the church's courts and the crown's courts began to overlap uneasily. Heresy trials became spectacles of both law and faith. Men and women who once faced the village priest for gossip or slander now faced inquisitors for words spoken in private. The same fire that had once purified gossip now consumed flesh. The people learned new kinds of fear. The visible and the invisible courts merged once more, but this time in darkness. Even the language of justice changed. Words like trespass, felony, and misdemeanor replaced the old local terms. The man who once answered to the reeve now faced clerks with quills and codes. The law no longer spoke in proverbs and stories, it spoke in numbers and fines. A new order of men, bailiffs, sheriffs, jurors, lawyers emerged, professionals of justice. The communal laughter of the pillory gave way to the solemn silence of the gallows. The punishment, too, changed in tone. The old theater of Shane stocks, ducking, and mock parades was gradually replaced by execution and imprisonment. The body was no longer corrected in public. It was removed, hidden away behind stone walls. The spectacle of pain gave way to the silence of confinement. Law began to operate not through fear of laughter but through fear of absence. In the midst of this transformation, some thinkers looked back with nostalgia. Chroniclers wrote of the ancient customs of the manor with melancholy respect. To them, the old laws had preserved community and balance, however rough. The new system, though efficient, felt impersonal, abstract. Justice had gained formality, but lost its face. The village itself began to change shape. Fairs became markets. Local guilds regulated trade under royal charters. Written contracts replaced oaths sworn before the altar. Coins replaced promises. The rhythms of the year, once dictated by feast days and harvests, yielded to the calendar of taxes and court sessions. The transformation was not only legal but spiritual. The medieval village, with its blend of superstition, devotion, and discipline, was fading into history. And yet, the memory of the old law persisted. In the 16th century, some peasants still carried charms against the king's eye, believing royal officials could curse crops. Others carved the shape of the cross into their doorframes to protect against bad judgments. Even as literacy spread and printing began to flood Europe with royal decrees, the villagers clung to their invisible protections. The king's peace had conquered the land, but not the heart. For generations afterward, people still whispered of the time when justice had a face, when the guilty were shamed under open sky, and when forgiveness could be bought with bread and salt instead of silver. The law had grown powerful but colder. In the next part, we will step into that final twilight of the Middle Ages, when the last echoes of village law merged with the dawn of modern nation-states, a time when superstition, sin, and sovereignty collided, and the medieval world took its final bow. Before the printed word conquered the mind of Europe, law itself was a living thing, a creature of ritual and belief. Every oath, every curse, every fine carried within it an echo of the supernatural. To the medieval villager, justice was not merely a social system, it was a spiritual landscape. The law could bless or destroy, heal or haunt, and beneath the stern Latin of royal decrees, old fears continued to breathe. Even as the king's peace expanded, many villagers still believed that certain words possessed real power. To speak falsely in court was not only to offend one's neighbor but to awaken invisible punishment. Swearing falsely upon the Bible could wither crops or call disease upon one's house. In some villages, it was said that those who perjured themselves would lose their shadow in sunlight, becoming ghosts before their time. The oath was thus both a legal tool and a charm, a ritual binding the living world to divine forces. The act of oath-taking was often theatrical. The accused would kneel, hand upon a relic or a crucifix, and call upon saints to witness their words. Sometimes a priest presided, sometimes the reeve or the manor steward. In certain regions of France and Germany, a bowl of holy water was placed between disputants, so that any lie spoken above it might ripple and betray the liar. In England, people feared the oath helper who lied on another's behalf. Such a person risked damnation not only for himself, But for the soul he defended, the medieval villager's concept of law blurred the line between truth and power. A lord's judgment was accepted not merely because of his title but because his word was believed to carry divine favor or, in darker whispers, infernal strength. Some lords were said to have the devil's parchment, a contract granting them victory in all disputes. When such a man ruled, few dared to contradict him. Certain legal punishments, too, were steeped in superstition. The ordeal trial by water or fire was the most famous. Officially abolished by the 13th century in most regions, it lingered in rural courts long after. To cast an accused witch into a pond was not seen as cruelty but as divine arbitration. If she floated, she was guilty, sustained by evil. If she sank, she was innocent and often dead. The people did not see the contradiction. In their eyes, water and flame spoke for God. Even as rational law advanced, new forms of invisible justice emerged. Villagers whispered of the night court, an otherworldly assembly said to meet beneath full moons, where the spirits of the dead judge the living. According to folklore from Brittany to Transylvania, those who broke oaths or cheated neighbors would be dragged from their beds to stand trial before these spectral judges. They would awaken at dawn with bruises or marks on their bodies, proof that the dead still upheld the law of the land. The mingling of Christianity and older pagan beliefs gave rise to strange hybrids of justice. In parts of rural Germany, the field judgment was practiced. Two disputants would walk side by side across a plowed field, reciting prayers. The one who stumbled first was declared guilty, for God or fate had judged his conscience. Elsewhere, villagers carried relics around the borders of their land to reaffirm property rights, believing that the saints themselves walked the perimeters to bless the soil. Law was also bound to omens and prophecy. The crowing of a rooster during a trial was seen as divine commentary. The fall of a candle, a sign of guilt. Some courts adjourned if thunder struck nearby, fearing that heaven objected to their proceedings. In Italy, records mention judges who postponed sentences until astrologers confirmed a favorable alignment of the stars. Justice, in those times, had a celestial schedule. At the heart of this invisible jurisprudence was the fear that the world was watching. Villagers believed that every lie left a stain upon the soul visible to angels and demons alike. Some chroniclers record that murderers would bleed again when near the corpse of their victim, a phenomenon known as the beer rite. If blood flowed from the wound when the accused approached, it was taken as proof of guilt. Even the king's peace could not suppress such beliefs. Royal judges sometimes allowed the ritual in remote regions, unwilling to offend local sensibilities. Superstition shaped not only the accused but the enforcers. The village constable often carried protective charms, a scrap of scripture, a saint's medal, or even a dried snake's head to shield himself from the curse of the condemned. Executioners, viewed as both necessary and unclean, were said to be immune to witchcraft but cursed in their sleep. Some refused to bury their tools, believing the blood on their axes must remain unwashed lest their own souls rot. There were also laws concerning the unseen world itself. In Scotland, fines could be levied for the disturbing of fairy rings. In parts of France, villagers swore not to cut certain ancient trees believed to be the dwelling places of spirits. To violate these taboos could invite both divine punishment and social ruin. Some priests tried to replace these customs with Christian blessings, but often they merely baptized the old spirits with new names. The fairy oak became St. Anne's tree, the ghost road became the pilgrim's path. In the borderlands between belief and law, the witch trials of the later Middle Ages found fertile ground. What began as superstition hardened into institution. The Church's obsession with heresy merged with rural fear of the uncanny, producing courts that claimed to seek truth through torture. The village, once governed by gossip and laughter, now trembled under the weight of written accusation. A woman who brewed herbs for healing might one day find herself bound in chains, accused of flying by night or cursing livestock. The paradox was terrible. Law had grown stronger, But fear had not diminished, it had merely changed its shape. Where once the villagers feared the wrath of saints or the shame of public punishment, now they feared the secret denunciation, the sealed warrant, the inquisitor's quill. Justice had moved from the square to the dungeon, from the spoken curse to the written confession. Yet even in those grim years, the people clung to remnants of mercy. Some villages secretly maintained their courts of reconciliation, where neighbors could settle disputes with bread, wine, and a handshake, invoking the Virgin's name rather than the Inquisitor's. These hidden rituals kept alive the memory of a law that was human, imperfect, and kind. By the 15th century, Europe stood between two worlds, one of sacred oaths and invisible courts, and another of codified statutes and bureaucratic power. The old ways were mocked by scholars, but remembered by peasants. Even as cities grew and laws multiplied, the countryside whispered with the ghosts of its forgotten judges. The peasants' faith in the unseen persisted long after parchment replaced prayer. And though the king's peace ruled and named every shadowed lane, every crossroads tree, every echo of midnight bells still belonged to the older law, the law of fear, of faith, and of unseen balance. In the next part, we will witness how these superstitions met the dawn of rationalism, how early modern Europe, born from the ashes of medieval fear, began to rewrite its laws not in blood and legend, but in ink and reason, yet never quite escaped the ghosts of its past. By the dawn of the 16th century, Europe was changing faster than any villager's imagination could follow. The old rhythms of harvest, confession, and superstition still pulsed through the countryside, but a new wind was rising, a wind of reform, learning, and administration. Where once the law had been a living voice whispered beneath a tree or shouted in the square, it now hardened into letters on parchment. The invisible became visible, the oral became written, and the written began to rule. The change was not sudden, nor was it merciful. In the earliest years of this transformation, the people of the villages felt more confusion than enlightenment. The Latin words of royal clerks and bishops seemed like magic incantations, and in a sense, they were charms of power, seals of authority that could reshape the fates of entire communities. Those who once swore oaths upon relics now found themselves swearing before notaries who wrote their names into books. The priest's blessing gave way to the magistrate's signature. The ink replaced the incense. At the heart of this transformation stood the rise of codified law, inspired by Roman legal traditions, and the rediscovery of ancient texts. Scholars in universities like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford began to assemble vast systems of order. Every custom, every penalty, every right and duty was to be measured, compared, and recorded. To the scholar's mind, the old ways of trial by ordeal or oath-taking were childish superstitions. The new law would be clean, reasoned, universal. And yet, the scholars who dreamed of reason were far removed from the villagers who lived beneath their decrees. To the peasant who had never seen a book, a written statute seemed no less mystical than the whisper of a ghost. He could not read it, but he felt its weight. The law had become a new kind of invisible power, not the hand of the saint, but the pen of the scribe. The clerks and jurists who enforced these new codes were the new priesthood of Europe. They wore black robes instead of vestments, but they too guarded sacred texts. Their words could bless or condemn, free or ruin. The village reeve, once chosen from among the farmers, was replaced by officials sent from distant towns. The common man's voice grew faint. Judgment no longer smelled of earth and sweat, it smelled of ink, wax, and vellum. In England, the rise of the common law under the Tudors reshaped the very texture of rural life. Every wrong had a corresponding form, every form a price. To break a hedge was no longer merely a sin against one's neighbor, it was a matter for the king's bench. In France, royal ordinances multiplied under the Valois kings, seeking to impose uniformity on hundreds of provinces, each with its own dialect and custom. In the German lands, the emperor's court at Speyer declared that the law of God and reason must supersede the law of peasants. The patchwork of Europe was being woven into a single garment. and the thread was bureaucracy. But law does not transform the soul as easily as parchment transforms policy. Beneath the surface, the old superstitions adapted rather than vanished. Judges and scribes might sneer at charms, yet some secretly carried them. Peasants learned to speak the language of the new courts, but they still crossed themselves before entering them. In the marketplace, people whispered that ink itself was cursed, that the first drop of every law book was mixed with the blood of a condemned man. Such stories were not literal belief, but expressions of unease, a subconscious rebellion against the cold impersonality of written authority. Meanwhile, a new force, the printing press, spread across the continent like wildfire. What had once been confined to the whispers of clerks now multiplied in thousands of copies. Statutes, proclamations, and decrees were nailed to church doors and marketplace walls. The written word, once rare and precious, became a weapon. Villagers who could not read learned to recognize royal seals and the shape of the king's name. They knew that where such signs appeared, obedience was expected. And yet, printing also carried seeds of rebellion. Pamphlets circulated criticizing unjust taxes, corrupt officials, and even the church itself. The same press that printed royal decrees began to print heresy. In the cities, the Reformation exploded. Martin Luther's theses, Calvin's doctrines, Zwingli's sermons, all written words, all challenges to the old order. For the first time, law and faith were being debated in public, and the very idea of authority began to crack. For the peasant, these changes were bewildering. He might still walk the same fields his grandfather had plowed, but the world around him was no longer governed by the same invisible laws. The saints who had once guarded his harvest were now denounced as idols. The feast days that marked his calendar were stripped away by reformers. Even his confessions were questioned. He was told that salvation came not from ritual but from faith, not from custom but from conscience. But conscience, too, was a kind of law, an inner court where the soul judged itself. In this period of upheaval, new forms of local resistance appeared. Some villages continued to hold their old courts in secret, settling disputes by custom even as official law demanded written petitions. Others mocked the growing bureaucracy by staging mock trials, festivals in which animals or effigies were judged for crimes. A pig might be sentenced to death for eating a child's bread, or a rooster condemned for laying an egg. These absurd spectacles were not mere jokes. They were acts of symbolic defiance, a way for the people to reclaim the drama of law that had been stolen from them. Meanwhile, the ruling powers sought to discipline not only bodies but minds. The late medieval obsession with heresy evolved into an early modern obsession with order. Vagabonds, beggars, and wanderers, those who belonged to no manor, no guild, no parish, became the new outlaws. The poor were branded as threats to stability. In England, the statutes of laborers and later the poor laws began to define poverty itself as a kind of crime. In Germany, vagrant laws allowed sheriffs to whip or expel anyone without papers. The law that once protected the weak now sought to contain them. And yet, even as the reach of power expanded, there remained an uneasy nostalgia for the vanished village justice. Chroniclers of the 16th century described with melancholy the days when disputes were ended by the sharing of ale and bread, when the worst punishment was public laughter. Some philosophers, like Erasmus and more, dreamed of a law guided by reason and mercy together, a law that could reform without cruelty. But such dreams were fragile. The iron logic of administration was already tightening around Europe's neck. As the century turned, the landscape of justice had transformed beyond recognition. Dungeons had replaced ducking stools, ledgers had replaced oaths. The voice of the people had become a murmur beneath the roar of institutions. And yet, deep beneath this new order, something ancient still stirred the memory of balance, of the old idea that justice was not merely written but lived. For even in a world ruled by codes, men and women still gathered at the edges of fields to settle quarrels, still swore by their honor. still told stories of saints and spirits who punished the proud and protected the humble. The rational law might triumph in the cities, but in the villages, the soul itself remembered. In the next part, we will explore that fragile coexistence, the moment when written law and living custom stood side by side, and easy allies in a world racing toward modernity, each claiming to be the true voice of justice. By the middle of the 16th century, the tide of order had swept across Europe, yet in the deep valleys and forgotten hamlets, the old ways clung to life. The peasants might bow before the king's peace and pay tithes to the bishop, but in their hearts and in their fields they still kept their own law. The written codes of monarchs spoke from parchment, the villagers' laws were carved into memory, and between these two worlds friction grew. The old law survived not because of rebellion, but because of necessity. The crown's officials could not reach every crossroads or forest clearing. Royal justice moved slowly, burdened by process and form. But a broken fence, a missing sheep, or an insult at the tavern could not wait for distant judges. So the villagers continued to gather at night beneath the linden tree or outside the church after Mass to decide their own matters. They did not call it resistance. They called it life. These village gatherings, often presided over by the oldest or most respected among them, followed traditions that were part legal, part ceremonial, and part sacred. The reeve, or sometimes the miller, acted as arbiter. Disputes were settled not by citation from law books but by memory and reputation. A man known for fairness might speak for the accused. A woman of strong faith might swear on her rosary that she had seen the truth. It was not justice as the scholars knew it, but it was justice that worked. The punishments were simple but meaningful. A liar might be forced to kneel before the parish and ask forgiveness. A thief might restore what was stolen and bring a loaf of bread to the church door as penance. A quarrel between neighbors might end with both parties sharing ale in public to prove their peace was genuine. These rituals were not written anywhere, yet they carried the full weight of communal belief. In some places, this unwritten system was so strong that even the local lord dared not interfere. The nobleman depended on his peasants. His fields could not be tilled without their cooperation. So he allowed them their customary rights, as long as they paid their dues and honored his authority and name. But those rights were fragile. Each generation risked forgetting them, and once forgotten, they could never be reclaimed. The arrival of royal surveyors and new taxation systems marked the beginning of the end. These officials brought maps, scales, and measurements into places where the world had been defined by landmarks and memory. The oak tree that marked the border between two farms was now replaced by ink lines on paper. Villagers protested, claiming that the land itself remembers its owner. But in the eyes of the crown, only what was written existed. The rest was rumor. In England, after the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII, vast tracts of common land were enclosed by wealthy landowners. The commons, where peasants had grazed animals for centuries, were fenced off and sold. The old law had said that every man had a right to the grass beneath God's sky. The new law said that only ownership mattered. In protest, some villages tore down the fences at night, whispering that they were restoring the law of the land. For this, they were branded rebels. Across Europe, similar tensions played out. In Germany, the Peasants' War of 1524 to 1525 erupted, driven not only by economic suffering but by a belief that ancient rights were being stolen. The peasants' 12 articles demanded freedom to choose their own pastures, to hunt and fish as their forefathers had, and to be judged by their own courts. They claimed that these were not new privileges but divine law, the true gospel, as it was in old times. When the revolt was crushed, thousands lay dead, and the surviving villages were forced to accept the written law of princes. But even in defeat, the peasants did not forget. Songs, stories, and proverbs carried their customs forward in secret. In the Alps, people spoke of the hidden Book of Rights, a mythical manuscript said to contain the laws of their ancestors. buried away to protect it from kings. In Brittany, villagers still gathered by moonlight to recite the ancient odes, invoking Saint Corentin as their witness. The written law might have conquered parchment, but not the imagination. In the daily life of these villages, law and faith continued to intertwine. Church bells still rang to mark curfew and harvest. Priests still blessed the fields and mediated disputes. Yet even the clergy were changing. Many younger priests, educated in seminaries, viewed old customs as superstition. They told their flock that charms, holy wells, and the justice of the dead were pagan relics. The villagers nodded, but after vespers, they still whispered to the spirits of their ancestors, asking for guidance. The clash between the old and new law was not always violent. Often it took the form of quiet defiance. When royal officers came to measure fields, the peasants led them in circles, confusing boundaries. When a written summons arrived from the city, it was accidentally lost in the fire. When a lord demanded payment in coin, the villagers brought chickens or sacks of grain instead, pretending not to understand. The law could reach the land, but not always the heart. Still, cracks were forming even in these bastions of custom. The younger generation, drawn to towns and trade, began to value money more than memory. They laughed at the elders' stories of fairies and oaths. To them, the new law meant opportunity, a chance to rise by wit and contract rather than birth and custom. The village was slowly being replaced by the marketplace. As the 16th century waned, the Reformation and Counter-Reformation further divided the old order. In Protestant lands, saints' days and rituals that had once served as communal courts were abolished. In Catholic regions, the Church itself began to codify its own laws more tightly, mirroring the bureaucracy of states. The sacred and the secular now competed in efficiency as much as in faith. Yet in the cracks between these great powers, fragments of the medieval world persisted. A widow accused of witchcraft might still appeal to the law of mercy. A dying man might insist that his confession before neighbors cleared him of all debts. Whether the ledger said otherwise, children were still taught proverbs that carried moral judgment, tiny laws disguised as wisdom. The land remembers, God sees the lie, the well gives no water to the thief. In these sayings lived the last heartbeat of the old justice. It was justice as experience, not doctrine, as memory, not decree, a world where sin and crime were the same, and where forgiveness could be bought not by gold but by humility. By the 17th century, this world was vanishing for good. The last generation of elders who remembered the unwritten customs died out, leaving their descendants with only fragments of song and tale. The young no longer gathered beneath the linden tree to settle disputes. They gathered in taverns to read broadsheets and listen to rumors from the city. The transformation was complete. The village had become a subject, and the king's peace had become law itself. And yet even in the most modernized corners of Europe, echoes of the old law still flickered. A peasant crossing himself before signing a document, a judge quoting a proverb instead of a statute, a farmer leaving bread on the boundary stone at midsummer. These gestures meant nothing to the scholars, but to those who performed them, they meant everything. They were whispers to a forgotten world. In the next part, we will follow those whispers into the early modern age, when the memory of the medieval village law became legend, and Europe learned to live not by custom, but by conscience. When the old oak tree fell and no one replaced it, the people knew something had changed. That oak had once been the meeting place, the heart of the village where laws were spoken aloud, not written. Its roots had heard every quarrel, every vow of peace, every punishment rendered in front of all. But now it was gone, and with it the memory of what justice had meant before parchment, seals, and kings. By the early 17th century, Europe was changing faster than any plowman or craftsman could have imagined. The city's law reached farther, and the world of the village seemed to shrink. But in that shrinking, a strange transformation occurred. The spirit of the old law did not die hid. It retreated inward, into conscience, into the mind and soul of ordinary people who could no longer speak their law aloud. The written law of monarchs and councils was cold, efficient, and impersonal. It sought to govern by logic, not by memory. But for centuries, the village had lived by something warmer, the belief that justice was born of community, that wrongs could be healed by apology and witness, that every punishment should serve the peace, not the crown. When this belief was stripped of its ceremonies and oaths, it did not vanish, it became moral law, private and invisible, carried in silence. In the villages that survived plague, war, and famine, people still clung to patterns that had once been legal acts. A mother whispering blessings over her child's cradle, a farmer refusing to plow a certain patch of land because it belongs to the spirits, a widow giving bread to the poor in penance for her late husband's cruelty. These gestures were no longer enforced by any village court, but they were done in the same spirit as unwritten duties. The early modern age saw a great codification of everything that had once been fluid. Kings like Louis XIV in France and Ferdinand II in Austria ruled by decree. Every act, every contract, every marriage had to be stamped, signed, and recorded. Bureaucrats replaced elders, documents replaced witness. And yet, in these same centuries, the idea of inner morality, that a man's soul could judge him more justly than any king, took root. This was not coincidence. It was inheritance. The old village law had always bound men not by fear of prison, but by fear of shame, of divine disfavor, of breaking the peace of neighbors. As centralized power crushed the village courts, this communal conscience turned inward. Now, instead of fearing what the village thought, people feared what God thought. The church's confessional replaced the village meeting. The priest's absolution replaced the community's pardon. But even within the church, this transformation was uneasy. Many priests in small parishes still acted as mediators rather than judges. They remembered when the law of God and the law of the land were spoken in the same breath, when a priest's blessing was part of the legal process. In Bavaria and parts of Italy, church records show curious entries. Dispute resolved before the altar, penance accepted as settlement, forgiveness granted in the name of peace. The ink of bureaucracy could not entirely erase the echo of the spoken word. Meanwhile, philosophers and jurists, men like Hugo Grotius and Thomas Hobbes, began to speak of natural law, of justice as something written not on paper, but on the human heart. They claimed to discover universal morality, yet what they were truly describing was something much older, the moral instinct born of centuries of communal life. The law that peasants had once carried in memory was now being reborn as philosophy. In the rural corners of England, Germany, and France, traces of the medieval laws persisted in strange ways. Customary fines still appeared in ledgers, a penny for trespass, a loaf of bread for false witness. Some villages continued to hold beating the bounds ceremonies where children and elders walked the parish borders, striking the stones with willow branches and reciting the old landmarks. It was both map-making and memory, law and prayer. When questioned by royal surveyors, the villagers would shrug and say, "So the earth remembers." The deeper one looks into this period, the clearer it becomes that the medieval spirit of law was not killed by progress, it was absorbed by the modern world. The concepts of fairness, mercy, and community responsibility survived, only hidden beneath new forms. The courts might speak of equity, the church might preach grace, philosophers might write of reason and conscience, but all these ideas had roots in those early gatherings beneath the oak. Still, for many villagers, the New World felt alien. A man could now be punished by a distant judge who had never seen his face. Fines were paid in coin rather than labor. Crimes were defined by statute rather than circumstance. Justice became something external, something done to a man rather than within. The warmth of collective judgment was replaced by cold legality. To those who had lived under the old customs, this felt like exile. Stories began to emerge, half myth, half protest, about times when the true law had vanished. In Scotland, They told of a lost charter of the Highlands signed by ancient kings to protect the poor. In Bohemia, legends spoke of the Book of Stone buried beneath a ruined abbey, containing the laws of the people. And in England, there was a persistent rumor of a village called Fairhold, whose folk refused to bow to royal judges and were spirited away into the mist, taken by their own law. Such tales were not rebellion, but mourning. They were the imagination's way of keeping faith with something that could no longer exist. The oak tree was gone, but in dreams it still stood, its branches heavy with whispered promises of justice. Meanwhile, Europe marched forward. The Enlightenment began to dawn. Cities grew, universities flourished, empires expanded. The law now spoke the language of reason and progress. And yet, the moral fabric of the people, their instinct to forgive, to reconcile, to live in peace with neighbors remained quietly medieval. It was the invisible thread holding the New World together. By the late 17th century, as science and philosophy reshaped Europe, some thinkers began to look backward with curiosity. Antiquarians and folklorists collected village sayings, seasonal rituals, and local odes, often mocking them as superstition. But in doing so, they preserved fragments of a world that had nearly vanished. From these collections, future generations would learn that Europe's legal modernity had deep roots in communal imagination. The village law, once spoken under trees and in churchyards, had become myth. But myth, as always, has power. It survives in art, in conscience, in the quiet spaces between laws. When the modern citizen obeys not just because he must, but because he feels it is right, when he forgives, when he seeks peace instead of victory, he is unknowingly repeating the gestures of those forgotten villagers. The law of parchment may govern nations, but the law of memory governs souls. In the next part, we will trace how these remnants of the medieval village spirit found new life in folklore and literature, and in the birth of Romanticism, how poets and thinkers turned forgotten custom into legend, and legend into identity. By the dawn of the 18th century, the old village law had largely disappeared from daily life, yet its shadow lingered in the fields, in the bells, and in the stories told beside the hearth. Even as bureaucrats and ministers codified the kingdoms of Europe, poets and philosophers began to look backward, searching for something they felt had been lost. What they found was not merely nostalgia for the medieval age, but a living pulse, a sense that beneath the paperwork of empire, the human spirit still remembered the oak tree, the gathering, and the voice of the common folk. In rural Europe, folklore became the new court. Customs once enforced as law turned into ritual or superstition. The ale-tasting, once a civic duty, became a festival. The boundary beating became a children's game. The tithing day, once a legal exchange, became a fairground celebration. People continued to perform these acts long after they forgot why. Because our fathers did so, they would say, a simple justification that carried centuries of forgotten law within it. In Germany, the Romantic thinkers of the late 18th century began to collect these customs with fervent admiration. The brothers Grimm, better known for their fairy tales, were also historians of law. They wrote that the folk tale was a window into the moral imagination of a people. When a story told of a clever peasant outwitting a cruel lord, or a maiden judged unfairly and saved by a talking bird, it echoed the same yearning for justice that had animated the medieval village courts. The Grimms recognized that beneath the fantasy lay the moral memory of Europe. Across the Channel in England, writers like William Wordsworth and Thomas Hardy found inspiration in rural life, not the elegance of courtly manners, but the quiet dignity of local tradition. Wordsworth's Michael, the tale of an old shepherd bound to his land by memory and duty, reads almost like an elegy for the vanished law of the commons. Hardy's novels, set in fictional Wessex, portrayed village justice not as primitive, but as deeply human, moral, and often more merciful than the formal courts that replaced it. In their works, the idea of custom became synonymous with truth, and the rural community stood as a moral counterpoint to the corruption of modern cities. Meanwhile, historians and ethnographers, fascinated by the persistence of these customs, began to write treatises about folklore. They noticed that in many villages, disputes were still settled privately by elders or clergy rather than in royal courts. In Brittany, Normandy, and the Swiss cantons, entire systems of unwritten arbitration survived into the 19th century. These were not the relics of ignorance but deliberate acts of remembrance, a refusal to let the law of kinship and reconciliation die. Even the Enlightenment, with its devotion to reason, could not entirely dismiss the wisdom of the past. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, though often critical of civilization, praised the small community where citizens knew one another and governed by shared virtue rather than decree. Montesquieu, in the spirit of the laws, wrote that every people had its own climate of justice, shaped by custom as much as by principle. These philosophers, while building the foundations of modern jurisprudence, were haunted by the ghost of the medieval village, the image of a society that governed itself through conscience rather than coercion. In the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution tore apart the last remnants of the old village world. Fields became factories, and peasants became workers. Yet even amid smoke and steel, the dream of the lost community returned in art and literature. The pre-Raphaelite painters turned to medieval subjects not for fantasy alone, but for moral purity. The Gothic revival in architecture reimagined cathedrals and guild halls as symbols of unity between faith, craft, and justice. To the Victorians, the Middle Ages were not barbaric. They were authentic, a time when law and soul had not yet diverged. Across Europe, national movements drew upon these romantic visions. In newly forming nations, Italy, Germany, Hungary, the Czech lands, intellectuals searched for their roots in peasant custom and village song. Collecting ballads and proverbs became a patriotic act. What had once been local law turned into national identity. The people, long governed by others, were rediscovered as the source of justice and culture. It was an irony of history. The humble traditions that the noble courts had once scorned now became the foundation myths of modern nations. But this revival carried a paradox. The village law that once bound neighbors in peace was transformed into a symbol of exclusivity, of our people against theirs. Folklore, stripped of its communal purpose, became a tool of ideology. The same spirit that had once reconciled quarrels now fueled nationalism and division. The oak tree of justice, once a shelter for all, was turned into a banner. Yet even in this transformation, something genuine persisted. When the world wars tore through Europe, destroying the very villages that had preserved these customs, old men and women told stories of how things were done in the old days. They spoke of laws that relied not on armies, but on honesty, not on prisons, but on shame. Amid ruin and exile, those tales offered a moral anchor, a memory that life could once be ordered by trust. In the mid-20th century, anthropologists like E.P. Thompson and Mark Bloch revisited the medieval roots of social order. Thompson's Whigs and Hunters explored how the moral economy of the crowd in 18th century England resembled the customary justice of the medieval village. Bloch's feudal society treated the oath, the gesture, and the ritual as the true language of medieval law. Both scholars saw that history was not a line of progress, but a spiral. Old forms reappeared whenever people sought fairness beyond bureaucracy. Today, echoes of the medieval village still haunt European life in subtle ways. Local councils, community courts, restorative justice movements, all these are, in spirit, descendants of that world where every man's voice mattered beneath the oak. Even modern law, with its concern for equity, mitigation, and social harmony, carries within it the DNA of the medieval conscience. When we speak of the rule of law, we often imagine something cold, external, mechanical. But to the medieval villager, law was warm, the living agreement, renewed each time hands were clasped or oaths were spoken. The rediscovery of that warmth, through art, literature, and community life, is what kept Europe human amid its revolutions. In the end, Perhaps that is the greatest legacy of those weird village laws. They remind us that justice begins not with rules, but with relationships. That the strength of a society lies not in its punishments, but in its capacity to forgive. The oak tree is long gone, but its spirit lives in every act of kindness disguised as law, in every reconciliation disguised as verdict, in every story that ends not with vengeance, but with peace. And so, the medieval village, strange, cruel, wise, and deeply human, never truly vanished. It merely changed its form, leaving behind not ruins, but roots that still feed the conscience of the modern world. The story of the medieval village does not end with its disappearance. Long after the bells ceased to toll for market day, after the manorial courts turned to dust, the legacy of those forgotten laws continued to whisper through the corridors of modern life. The people who once gathered beneath trees, who weighed justice by the warmth of the fire and the judgment of neighbors, gave us something that no statute could replace. The understanding that law is not only command, but conscience, not only rule, but relationship. When we look at the world today, we might believe we are far removed from the habits of the 13th century. Our cities glow with light, our courts are marble and steel, our judgments are typed rather than spoken. Yet, hidden deep within the structure of our societies, the same moral rhythm beats on. It surfaces in the idea of the jury born from the village assembly where 12 neighbors swore an oath to tell the truth. It lives in restorative justice, where reconciliation takes precedence over punishment, a direct descendant of the medieval practice of atonement and peacemaking. Even the language of law bears the fingerprints of that old world. Words like witness, faith, trust, and contract come from a time when to speak was to bind oneself before God and community. In medieval villages, the oath was sacred. Breaking it was not merely fraud but spiritual collapse. That same sanctity still lingers when we swear in court, place a hand on a holy book, or promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. These are not empty words. They are echoes, the ritual remnants of an age when truth was a matter of survival, not bureaucracy. In the slow march of history, as kings became parliaments and subjects became citizens, the heart of justice remained surprisingly constant. The medieval villager believed that peace was not the absence of crime, but the presence of harmony. A quarrel between neighbors could be healed by apology, a theft mended by return, a sin cleansed by penance. These instincts, older than parchment and deeper than kingship, survived in the hidden corners of our moral code. Modern law may have hardened them into principle, but the essence remains, the belief that law should restore, not destroy. One can still see it in small towns across Europe, where the old communal habits persist in new forms. Parish meetings, neighborhood councils, public mediations. These are modern gatherings beneath invisible oaks. The talk is less about cattle or fences now and more about zoning or traffic. Yet the spirit is unchanged. People assemble not to demand power, but to share responsibility. They listen, they argue, and at last they find peace in compromise. That is the medieval conscience, at work, the living remnant of collective justice. And there is more. Consider the holidays we celebrate, the festivals that have outlasted their origins. May Day, Harvest Home, St. John's Eve each began as a legal and moral gathering, a reaffirmation of shared order. To dance around the maypole was not just merriment. It was a public act of unity, a declaration that the year had turned, that the village still held together. These festivals endure because they remind us that law is not only judgment, but rhythm, the pattern by which community survives time. Literature and cinema, too, keep this memory alive. The endless fascination with medieval worlds in novels, films, and games is not simply escapism. It is yearning. We long for that world because it offers what modern life often forgets, the intimacy of shared fate, the certainty that each life, however humble, mattered to the whole. Beneath the fantasy armor and the shining castles, what we truly seek is the moral simplicity of the village, a place where justice could still be spoken aloud, where right and wrong were personal, and where forgiveness had a name and a face. Yet, as we look back, we must also remember the darkness of that time. The same laws that nurtured peace also enforced cruelty. The same communal order that created belonging could banish the different, the poor, the outcast. The stocks, the scold's bridle, the witch's trial. These were born of fear, not mercy. And so the modern world, in its rush toward progress, rightly discarded them. But even in rejecting the form, we kept the yearning for balance, the idea that justice should still answer to something greater than power. Today, as societies wrestle with inequality, distrust, and alienation, the ghost of the medieval village returns once more, not as nostalgia but as reminder. Every call for transparency, every demand for local voice, every movement toward community-based justice is at heart a reaching back to that time when law was shared, not imposed. We seek again the warmth of belonging, the courage of participation, the slow wisdom of collective decision. In an age ruled by algorithms and faceless authority, the voice of the villager, slow, stubborn, human, matters more than ever. For all its strangeness, the medieval world teaches us a simple truth. Justice is not born in courts, it is born in hearts. The oak tree stood not because it was sacred wood, but because people believed it was the right place to gather. The power of law was never in the charter or the seal, but in the eyes that met, the hands that joined, the silence that followed after forgiveness. When we build systems today, digital, political, or social, we would do well to remember that no law, however perfect, can replace the moral bond of community. No punishment can heal what understanding alone can mend. The medieval villagers, with their odd customs and impossible faith, knew that truth. They lived it every day in the rhythm of labor and prayer, laughter and grief. And so, the weirdest village laws of medieval Europe, the rules about pigs and bread, about colors and tongues, about silence and bells, were not merely curiosities of a superstitious age. They were the scaffolding of civilization, the grammar of coexistence, strange, sometimes cruel, but always human. Through them, we inherited the idea that the law must serve life, not the other way around. The oak tree is long gone, its stump buried under centuries of soil and memory. But if you walk through the fields at dusk, where the fog rolls over furrows and the church bell tolls faintly in the distance, you might still hear something, not a voice, but a hum. A murmur of the past reminding you that justice began as a story told between neighbors. And perhaps that is how it should end, not with a verdict, but with a tale of bread and beer, of sin and forgiveness, of laughter and fear, a tale that begins and ends the same way, with people gathered beneath the sky, trying to live together in peace.